Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. On a warm November night in 1982 in a small town in the state of Chiapas, Fernando, a middle-aged man known for his fishing skills, had decided to organize a night out with his closest friends, Junior and Claude Meir. The three of them shared a passion for deep-sea fishing, and the Lacanton River with its current, mysterious and dense vegetation that surrounded it was his place, a favorite to spend long hours telling stories and catching fish. That night the full moon illuminated the dense jungle, creating a spectacle of shadows that lengthened and twisted as if they had a life of their own. The men walked loaded with their reeds, lanterns and a thermos of strong coffee, ready to face nature. There was an unsettling air, but none wanted to mention what they felt. The idea was common in those villages, and any hint about it, spirits or apparitions, could ruin the evening. They arrived at the river, mounted their equipment and began fishing while casting their lines. The conversation focused on local stories of strange animals sighted in the jungle, lights that appeared in the sky and disappeared without a trace, and the legends of the Aluxes, small mischievous beings that protected the territory. Close to midnight, something broke the routine. A strange flash appeared among the trees. On the other side of the river was an intense bluish light that seemed to pulsate as if it had a heartbeat of its own. At first they thought it was a group of hunters with flashlights, but the way the light moved zigzagging with unnatural speed ruled out that possibility. "You saw that?" Junior asked with a pale face. "It must be a fire." "Fato," replied Fernando, trying to downplay its importance. Although his tone of voice betrayed his nervousness, "That was not, it's normal," muttered Claude Meir, who seemed unable to take his eyes off the light. The intensity of the flash increased, and suddenly the light seemed to come to life. It rose above the trees, and in a matter of it crossed the river and landed a few meters from them. Now they could see it with clarity. It was not a simple light, but a vibrant, translucent sphere, with flashes that seemed to form geometric patterns inside the air around felt charged, as if a thunderstorm was about to break out. "Let's get out of here," cried Fernando, pulling Claude Meir, who remained by the strange phenomenon before they could react. A ray of light descended from the sphere, pointing directly towards Claude Meir. He fell to his knees with his eyes fixed on the sky and the body completely motionless. Fernando and Junior, terrified, tried to get closer, but the heat emanating from the sphere, he forced them back. The light began to rise slowly, taking Claude with him. His friend's body floated as if it had no weight as a heart-rending scream came out of his throat. Fernando reacted instinctively, took a branch from the ground and threw it towards the sphere. The instant the branch touched it, the light suddenly vanished, letting Claude Meir fall to the ground with a noisy. Claude Meir quickly approached. He was alive, but his body was shaking uncontrollably and his skin showed strange burns as if he had been marked with incomprehensible symbols. His gaze was lost and he did not seem to recognize them. "We have to take him to the village," Fernando said in an urgent voice, carrying his friend on his shoulder, while Junior lit the way with his flashlight. When he arrived in the village, they left Claude Meir in the small local clinic. The doctor, bewildered by the wounds, could only treat her on the surface and recommended that he be transferred to a hospital in the city. However, before they could make the arrangements, Claude Meir began to suffer convulsions, died at dawn, leaving his friends with a fear that they could not express. After Claude Meir's death, Fernando and Junior were deeply affected. The news of what happened spread quickly through the small town, and although few believed in the story of the mysterious light, they all agreed on that something strange had happened. The marks on Claude Meir's body were the central topic of conversation among the inhabitants, but no doctor or local expert could offer a convincing explanation during the funeral. Fernando felt a constant uneasiness, as if an invisible presence was watching him. It was a heavy, oppressive sensation that intensified at nightfall that same night, while he was trying to fall asleep. Fernando heard strange noises outside his house. He got up, took a machete and went out into the courtyard. The air was cold and still, but in the distance he could see a flash of light that quickly faded through the trees. He returned to his bed restless, not knowing that this was only the beginning. The next day, unknown men arrived in the village wearing impeccable black suits, something unusual in a place where the dress was mostly informal. They introduced themselves as government officials, and they began to ask questions. They wanted to know details about what happened in the river, especially about the death of Claude Meir. They interrogated Fernando and Junior separately, insisting on knowing every detail of the night when the sphere of light appeared. Fernando noticed that these men had something strange. Their movements were mechanical, their expressions devoid of emotion, and their eyes seemed to analyze everything with unsettling precision. When the interrogation was over, one of them, he warned him, "It is better that they do not talk about what they saw. We do not want to alarm the community with exaggerated stories." That same day, something even more disturbing happened. Junior was found dead in his house. His body was mutilated in a grotesque way, as if he had undergone an inhumane surgical procedure. Several organs were missing, but there were no signs of blood. The case left the town in a state of SOC. The local police did not know how it didn't take long for the men in black suits to arrive on the scene. Fernando, consumed with fear, knew that the next thing could be him. Junior's death had been brutal, but what terrified him the most was the silence surrounding the case. A public autopsy was not allowed, and the body was quickly removed by the men, those who refused to give explanations. As the days went by, Fernando began to notice strange things. At night, fleeting lights appeared near his house. During the day, he had the feeling of being followed, but he never managed to see anyone. His wife, worried about his condition, insisted that they leave the town, but Fernando hesitated. Although fear consumed him, he felt that abandoning the place was to accept his defeat before the unknown. One night, while he was sleeping, was awakened by a sharp and piercing sound. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the room was lit by a faint glow. Blue got up immediately, but when he opened the door to investigate, everything was silent and dark. When he returned to the room, he found a mark on the wall as if it had been burned with a hot iron. The shape of the mark was strangely familiar to him. It was similar to the symbols that had appeared on Clodomir's skin. The incident was the straw that broke the camel's back. The next morning, Fernando packed the essentials and together with his wife left the village. They moved to a nearby state inn, the hope of starting over and escaping the nightmare. However, fear and paranoia had permanently settled in him. Even in his new home, he couldn't help but look through the window every night, hoping not to see again that light that changed his life forever. Fernando and his wife settled in a small town in Veracruz, where they tried to rebuild their lives. The region, surrounded by mountains and jungles, seemed ideal to go unnoticed. They had chosen the place because no one there knew their history, and they hoped that the distance would dispel the shadows that followed him from Opus. However, the terror they had the first few months passed relatively calmly. Fernando could not shake the feeling of being watched from time to time. He noticed small details that worried him. A car parked in front of his house for too long, a stranger who seemed to be watching him from afar, or the echo of footsteps in the night. Paranoia intensified when he found an anonymous envelope under the door. Inside there was a note written with perfect handwriting that said, "We know where you are that night." Fernando decided to take extreme measures, closed all the windows, reinforced the doors, and began to sleep with a machete next to his bed. His wife, although terrified, tried to remain calm and convinced him to seek help in the church. Locke, the priest of the town, an older man with a calm voice, listened attentively to his story, spoke to him about the importance of faith, and told him he suggested praying to find peace. But Fernando knew this was going beyond spiritual matters. Something tangible, something real was haunting him. One early morning, Fernando was awakened again by a noise. This time it was not a high-pitched sound or a flash of light, but something much more disturbing. A constant sharp knock on the back door of his house. He got up with machete in hand and with his heart beating at full speed, directed towards the origin of the sound. From a sandbox, he managed to see a dark figure standing in front of the door. The figure was tall, thin, and seemed completely motionless, as if he were waiting for something. "Who is there?" Fernando shouted, trying to hide the trembling in his voice. He got no response, only a heavy silence that felt like a pressure in the chest. Then slowly and deliberately the figure leaned towards the crack as if he knew exactly where Fernando was looking. The only thing he could make out in the gloom were intense eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. He instinctively recoiled, and when he looked again at the figure had disappeared. Fernando could not sleep that night. The next morning he found strange marks on the back door, symbols similar to those that had appeared on Clodomir's skin and on the wall of his old house. In desperation he decided to tell his wife everything. She, although terrified, proposed that he go even further to a place where they could disappear completely. Fernando accepted, but not before leaving something prepared. That same afternoon, he went to the local police station and reported that someone had tried to enter his house. He knew that the agents would not take the full story seriously, so he omitted the strangest details. He asked for a patrol in the surroundings, but inside he knew that this would not stop those who were looking for him for days, because the couple he prepared to leave while they loaded his old car with the few belongings they could carry. Fernando noticed something in the distance. A man in a black suit was standing at the entrance of the town, apparently watching him. Although he was far away, Fernando felt that the eyes of that man were fixed on him. He tried to ignore him. He got into the car and drove without looking back. The trip was long and exhausting. They decided to go to a town in Durango, a remote place where they hoped to finally find tranquility. For weeks, things seemed to improve. There were no strange lights, no anonymous notes, no figures in the dark. However, Fernando could not relax. He felt that the calm was only the prelude to something worse. One night, while checking the surroundings of his new house, he heard a familiar sound that froze him in its place, a hum like that of an electric machine echoing in the air. He looked towards the sky and saw a blue light moving between the mountains. She ran back to the house, but when she entered, she found his wife standing in the middle of the living room with her gaze fixed on the window. "What's going on?" he asked, approaching her. She didn't answer. Her eyes were empty, as if she were in a trance. Before Fernando could react, the blue light enveloped the house, filling everything with a clarity. Fernando felt his body freeze, unable to move as the buzzing increased into an unbearable roar, and then everything went out. When he woke up, he was alone. His wife had disappeared and the house was completely empty, as if they had never lived there. The few things they had brought with them had disappeared, and the walls were covered with the same symbols that had haunted him since that night in the Fernando River, consumed by horror. He understood that there was no escape, no matter where he went or how much he tried to hide. What was chasing him was something greater, something he could not understand or face. The years passed and Fernando never saw his wife again or received news of her. He wandered through different towns, always on the move, always alert. Although he avoided talking about his experience, he left a written record of everything he lived as a warning for anyone willing to listen. They say that he died alone in a rural hospital with a last word on his lips. Light. It was a dark night in which Alex and Sarah arrived at an isolated camp in the heart of the Sierra Gorda Mountains in Querétaro. Both had planned this getaway for days to disconnect from the routine, looking for the peace of nature and the silence of the forests. Nothing could have prepared Sarah for what was about to happen. The place seemed perfect for camping, far from civilization, surrounded by lush trees and mountains that rose like towering guardians. But as the sun set and the sky was in a deep lull, a strange sensation began to invade the air. Alex, always curious and adventurous, lit a fire while he plowed the backpacks and utensils to the temperature was dropping rapidly and the shadows were starting to lengthen like dark fingers sliding on the ground. "Do you feel good?" Alex asked, seeing Sarah restlessly as she looked at the forest surrounding the camp. "Yes, it's just that the place feels weird, don't you think?" Sarah replied, feeling a chill run down her spine. Although she was trying to stay calm, something wasn't right. Alex laughed, trying to relieve the tension. "It's just the darkness. It's not that what we expected. A little mystery in the air never hurts." However, the feeling of unease persisted that night as the fire crackled and the stars shone above them. They began to hear strange sounds. At first they thought it was the wind moving the branches of the trees, but as the sound repeated, they became aware that something did not add up. It seemed like a whisper, something coming from the depths. From time to time the sound was followed by a faint glow that briefly illuminated the shadows. Sarah thought something was moving through the trees, but when she tried to point it out it was gone. "You see it?" she asked, her pained voice. "Something is moving out there." Alex got up and walked to the edge of the camp. The cool breeze caressed her face, but there was nothing visible beyond the circle of light that formed the campfire. "Is only the wind." Sarah hesitated but decided not to insist. However, she could not shake the feeling of being observed. Something in the gloom seemed to wait as if it were stalking them. The night continued its course and they both tried to rest in their sleeping bags, but the sound of the wind through the trees changed into something more, a slow and deliberate creak as if something heavy was walking near the tent. Sarah woke Alex up in a start. "As you hear it?" Alex whispered in a trembling voice. Alex still sat up next to me and heard a louder whisper, followed by a flash of light that fleetingly illuminated the outside of the tent. "This is not right," Alex muttered as he got up and began to take out the equipment to check around the camp. But what they found sealed the blood in the distance between. A tall, slender gray figure was moving slowly. It was barely visible, but the glow it emitted seemed to come from herself, as if she were a shadow that stripped away its natural form. To take another, the eyes of the dark and unblinking figure shone brightly, staring at them with a gaze so fixed that it seemed to penetrate her soul. Sarah took a step back, paralyzed with terror. She could not push away the sight of that creature that with his presence seemed to have materialized from the darkness. "Alex, who is that person?" whispered Sarah with a pale face. Alex could not answer. Something in the air seemed to become denser. The gray figure moved a step towards them, and then everything went out, the glow disappeared, and silence took over the camp. "Let's go back to the tent," Alex said, his voice deep and urgent now. But Sarah, she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, as if the gray figure had cast a spell on her. She couldn't stop looking at her, and at some point she began to hear something, a whisper, low, as if the figure was talking to her through her mind. "Sarah, what do you feel?" Alex asked. Worried when he saw that his friend was not reacting, she tried to move, but her legs were not responding. She finally managed to turn her head towards Alex, but her eyes were empty, as if she had lost all ability to react. "Those eyes," murmured her voice, barely a sigh. "I feel like I'm being dragged away." Alex took her arm, shook her in despair. But Sarah kept looking at the figure, hypnotized by her presence. Suddenly the figure began to move away, fading little by little into the shadows. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, finally able to move. "Whatever is not of this world," Alex replied with a lump in his throat. The next day the sun rose over the mountains, bathing the camp in its golden light. The fresh morning air seemed to erase, at least superficially, the fear of the previous night, but the uneasiness did not disappear. Sarah and Alex sat by the extinguished fire in complete silence, not knowing what to say. The memories of the gray figure continued to haunt them like an indelible shadow, that it clung to his mind even though they tried to convince themselves that it had been the product of darkness or some strange dream. Something inside them told them that what they had seen was real. Sarah did not want to talk about them. Her face was tense, her eyes avoided looking directly at him, and her mind seemed trapped in a cycle of denial. Alex, on the other hand, could not stop thinking about what she had experienced. The terror he had felt was so deep that his stomach still hurt. But something else was making him an insatiable need to know more. What that figure was, so petrified his mind couldn't stop spinning around those questions. Something didn't fit. "I'm going to look for something in the woods." Alex finally tried to break the heavy silence. "Maybe we'll find something that explains all this." Sarah raised her voice, seen with his face still pale. "No, Alex. Don't get any closer to the forest. Something is not right here. Here, let's leave this behind. We're going to go back to the city." But Alex was determined. Since he had seen that shadow, something inside him had awakened, something that pushed him to understand what had happened, to look for an explanation, even if it was terrifying. "I'm coming, I just promise you." Alex insisted, "only for a few minutes. I'm not going to get a long way away. I need to see if there is any explanation." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of frustration and fear, but she didn't say anything else. She stood there looking at the ground as he went into the woods. The sound of his footsteps faded with each meter he advanced in the background. Sarah knew that something was happening to Alex. Her obsession with the gray figure was consuming him, and she couldn't stop it. In the moment Alex crossed the boundary of the camp and went into the woods, the air became heavier and the silence surrounded him like a dense blanket. The sound of the trees moving with the wind seemed muffled, as if nature itself was holding its breath. As the daylight progressed, it seemed to fade little by little, absorbed by the shadow of the trees. Shortly after walking a few minutes after, he saw something that made him stop in seco. A dim light floated before him as if it were a lighthouse in the darkness of the forest. It was a sphere that emitted a gray glow similar to that of the figure they had seen the night before. It was not a fire or a lamp. It was something strange, something that defied any logical explanation. The sphere seemed to float without any support, as if it was suspended by forces invisible. Fear began to take hold of him, but curiosity pushed him closer with each step. The sphere moved, guiding him to a deeper place in the forest. Alex couldn't stop looking, as if he were hypnotized by that light. It didn't take long for him to realize that something else was around him, a strange sensation, an invisible weight pressing on him from all sides. "Alex, Alex," whispered to him. Surprised, and jumped back, but he saw no one. There was nothing. The forest was silent again, but the whisper persisted, repeating his name over and over again as if coming from all directions. Alex felt a pressure in his chest. as if the atmosphere itself was enveloping him. He turned looking for the origin of the sound, but instead he saw something much more disturbing there in the middle of the fog than he was beginning to rise among the trees. He saw a figure, a small child standing staring at him. The boy seemed to be alone, without clothes, with an empty expression on his face. His eyes were dark like those of the gray shadow and did not blink. That child inexplicably seemed to be waiting for him to approach. Terror immediately took hold of him. "What are you doing here?" Alex shouted, not knowing if the child could hear him, but instead of answering, the boy took a step towards him as if inviting him to follow him. Unable to resist the force that propelled him, Alex began to walk towards the figure. At that moment the boy turned and Alex followed him, not realizing that he was moving further and further away from the camp, going into the heart of the forest. Suddenly the boy stopped and saw him crouch down as if he was playing something on the ground. As he approached, Alex felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a feeling of intense cold that ran down his spine. When he turned, there was nothing behind him, only darkness and a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "Now, you are also part of us." Alex took a step back, his heart beating frantically in his chest. The atmosphere around him became ever more oppressive, as if the air had become denser, making it difficult for him to breathe. The whisper persisted, enveloping him, distorting his thoughts. He felt the gaze of the figure, the boy riveted on his back as he tried to regain his composure. But when he looked back to where the boy had been, there was nothing left. The mist that covered the ground had thickened, so much so that he could barely see a couple of meters beyond the trees at a distance. His surroundings seemed to move, but not by the wind, but as if they were alive, as if their trunks and branches were slowly twisting. Watching him, Sarah cried out to her trembling voice, "Sarah, help me!" But her cry was absorbed by the silence of the forest. There was no answer. He felt completely alone, surrounded by that thick mist that seemed to close in on him. Every step he took in his attempt to return to the camp took him farther away from the security he had felt before. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the figures in the fog began to take shape in the blink of an eye. Alex saw something else. The floating lights, those grayish spheres, returned. They were everywhere, now slowly swirling around him as if they were entities studying him. Suddenly one of them came dangerously close in his head, as if something was trying to invade his mind. Did not scream, taking his head in his hands as if he could expel that terrifying feeling. Then a shuddering sound was heard behind him. It was not a whisper, but a lament, a deep cry that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. Alex turned on his heels, and there, in the fog, he saw one more figure. It was a woman with her face covered by a dark veil, who was crying in such an inconsolable way that his blood froze. His voice mingled with the wind, and the sound seemed to reverberate inside his head. "Alex, Alex," Sarah's voice called him from afar, as if he had been lost in that same dream, in that same horror. Sarah screamed again in desperation, ran towards the direction of the voice, not knowing if it really came from her or if it was another illusion. The crying, however, continued in her path, stumbled, and the floating lights fell, rushing quickly with fear on the surface. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like hours, she managed to find the path to the camp. The fog was slowly beginning to dissipate, but the terror persisted in her mind. When she arrived, she found Sarah sitting in front of the tent, with empty eyes, looking at the horizon. She did not move or react when Alex called her, and for a moment Alex thought she was no longer there. Approached cautiously, her heart pounding. "Sarah, you're fine." Her voice breaking, the woman slowly raised her head. Although her eyes seemed to be empty, a lone tear rolled down her cheek. "I saw something," she whispered without looking at Alex. "Something in the woods," her face soaked with sweat and soul tormented by what she had experienced. He looked at her with disbelief. "What did you see, Sarah?" Sarah looked at him finally, and his eyes showed the deepest fear Alex had ever seen in his life. "I saw something that was not human, Alex, something that touched me. I felt his cold fingers on my neck, and then I heard the cry of a child was very close, but when I looked there was nothing." Alex couldn't stand it more. The fear I had felt in the forest now came back with force, hitting him like an unstoppable wave. The air in the camp felt dense, as if everything around them was waiting, watching with gasps of breath. He approached Sarah and hugged her, but his mind couldn't stop thinking about what he had experienced. They couldn't be sure if what they had experienced was real or a product of their imagination. But what they did know is that something had marked them forever that night. As the camp fell into an eerie silence, They both knew that they could not return to this place. The terror they had experienced was something that would haunt them forever, and although they could not explain it either, they could not ignore it. The next morning they quickly gathered their things and drove away from the camp. The road to the village seemed endless, and the air in the mountains no longer felt as fresh or as welcoming as at the beginning as they walked. Alex glanced at the forest that had surrounded them deep in the trees. He thought he saw something moving, something that watched him with those dark eyes that he would never forget. Sarah asked in a whisper, without looking at Alex. He didn't answer in a firm voice anymore, and so as the camp disappeared behind them, they both knew that they would never return to that place. The gray shadow, the floating lights, and the strange figures in the forest would remain forever in their memory, and although they tried to forget something inside them, I knew that what they had found in that forest was not of this world. I work for a company that sells large quantities of products from a small warehouse. The items we sell are often very expensive, so I was hired to guard the place during the night hours most of the night. As the warehouse is small, there is no need to patrol all the time. Mainly I stay in the office and watch the live feeds from various security cameras. During the first 3 years of work, nothing ever happened. No one showed up at odd times. There was no attempt to invasion. Absolutely nothing. It was a monotonous job that often made me let my guard down. Although staying alert was essentially my role that particular night, I drove up to the small parking lot and parked near the front door next to the car. The only other employee who was still there when I walked in let him know I had arrived, and he left shortly after, check and make sure, then settled into the office and stared at the screens. After about half an hour, my attention began to wane, and I pulled out my phone. Still, I was looking at the camera feeds every 30 seconds or more, but nothing changed. Then, shortly before 1 a.m., the system beeped. I had only heard that sound during the initial checks I did at the beginning of my shifts, so this was the first time something real activated it. Quickly checked the alert, and I saw that it was for motion detection. Someone was walking along the limit line. It took me a few moments to find the right camera, but finally, at the back of the building, I saw a man walking right at the edge of the parking lot where the lawn begins. He was wearing a thick sweatshirt and was too far away to see his face clearly. The direction he was walking didn't lead to any important place. Over there, on foot or by car, I watched as he moved towards the end of the parking lot, alternating between the cameras to keep him in sight. Suddenly, he stopped for a moment and looked straight at the building, turned its head, scanning the area before stepping onto the concrete and walking to the side of the warehouse. The situation quickly went from simply bizarre to potentially serious as it moved along the side of the building, stopped at each door, inspecting without attempting to open. Then, just looked around silently and continued walking. When it reached the corner, circled it to the front, and approached the main entrance from the comfort of the building. I watched him at the door, the sound echoing inside the warehouse. I got up from the chair. I opened the office door slowly and peered down the hallway to see the man standing behind the video doors. I doubted he could see me through the reflective video, so I stopped in the doorway to watch him. He looked inside and knocked again. I went back to the office and pressed the button. Speakerphone to talk to him. This is private property. He must go now for the camera. I saw that he was looking towards the speaker. He seemed ready to talk, but instead he frowned and struck once more. At that moment, an unsettling sensation took hold of me, an instinctive reaction to his peculiar actions, focusing on the camera. I noticed that he kept one of his hands hidden in his pocket, which alarmed me. The situation might be more dangerous than I initially thought. I called the police on our security system, establishing an immediate connection, and began to describe what was happening as I relayed the details to the dispatcher in the hallway. The man suddenly pulled an object out of his pocket and slammed it against the door. I couldn't see the object clearly, but the sound and impact suggested it was metal, probably intended for breaking the glass. I ran back to the office. It's listening to more banging as I closed the heavy door behind me. Once you checked again, only to see the man fleeing in. A few moments he disappeared from all camera views while waiting for the police. I reviewed the footage and saw clearly that he was wielding a small weapon, using the handle to hit the glass. We made a detailed report, but despite having clear images, the man remained unidentified. We still didn't know his intentions, but his aggressive response to my warning indicated that he didn't care that I was in there. The glass door now showed a small crack, a grim reminder that he was moments away from forcing his way in, forcing me to face what he had planned. Night had come in the small town of San Andres, a place known for its streets, quiet and colonial houses. but also by an old sewer system that snaked under the ground like a sleeping monster. Julio, an ordinary man, had just finished a long day of work and was getting ready to go to bed. Before doing so, he decided to make a quick visit to the bathroom. An everyday and unimportant act, or at least that's what he thought. The silence in the house, it was absolute. The wind was blowing softly outside, making the windows creak, but Julio barely noticed it. Sat down on the porcelain toilet looking for a moment of peace. However, something disturbing began to infiltrate his mind. He has ever felt that you are being watched in the most intimate moments? That thought and rationale crossed Julio's head as he absent-mindedly stared at the floor. But then something happened. A strange noise, a faint splash that shouldn't be there, broke the silence. Julio frowned and looked at the toilet bowl. I must not be imagining things, he thought, trying to convince himself that there was nothing out of the ordinary. But the sound persisted to now, clearer. It came from the depths of the toilet. Taking a breath, he decided to lift the lid cautiously, not knowing that this act would change his life forever. What he saw left him paralyzed. Some small dark eyes were watching him from the water, glistening with an unnatural pallid. It was a mouse, but not just any mouse. It was bigger than usual, soaked and with its body dirty from the sewer water. Its yellow teeth seemed to glow in the gloom of the bathroom. Julio tried to scream, but panic closed his throat. The mouse, far from being scared, jumped out of the toilet with a high-pitched squeak, throwing itself towards him. Julio backed away sharply. Stumbling and falling to the ground, the soaking wet rodent ran across the floor before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Heart beating uncontrollably, Julio stood on the bathroom floor, his mind unable to process what had just happened. The images of the aggressive mouse, the splashing of the water, everything was repeated in his head over and over again. It was as if his own home had been invaded by something beyond his comprehension. The feeling of the security that he had always felt at home vanished the next day. Still in a state of SOC, he decided to write a letter to the health authorities of the town. He described the incident in detail, still unable to believe what had happened. I had never felt so vulnerable in my own home, he confessed in the letter. Shortly afterwards, the local media echoed his story. They contacted Mr. Domingo Perez, a specialist in pest control who had worked in the region for more than 20 years. Is a life-changing experience, Domingo said when asked about sewer mice. These incidents are more common than people think and always take you by surprise. The expert explained that in the last 10 years, more than 400 cases of mice emerging from toilets had been reported in the region. In San Francisco alone, Andres, he and his team had dealt with between 80 cases a year. The mice have learned to navigate the sewer system in search of food, he said, adding that they are often attracted to the food scraps that people throw down the kitchen drain when they can't access the kitchen. And if they hear strange noises, don't panic, he said. According to him, the best thing to do in these cases is to give several shocks. The mouse usually gets tired and goes back the way it came from or drowns. He explained, however, the solution is not always so simple. Some mice are surprisingly persistent. Domingo commented, on one occasion we had to give more than 5 shocks to evicting one who did not want to leave our small, but tenacious. Although Julio had managed to overcome the incident, the feeling of vulnerability never completely left him. His bathroom, before a place of tranquility and privacy, had become a constant source of anxiety, and although Domingo and his team had managed to control the situation, Julio always wondered if he would ever return to his home. Other places in the world, the sewer system is not just a network of pipes, it is a dark and dangerous kingdom inhabited by creatures that emerge when you least expect it, challenging the safety of your home and turning the most mundane routine into a nightmare from which it is not so easy to wake up. In a quiet community of Santiago de la Sierra, a picturesque town nestled between mountains in northern Mexico. Born on 12 in November 1991, a young man named Mateo Alvarez Sandoval came from a middle-class family known in the town for its good manners and active participation in community events. Mateo was a reserved but brilliant boy whose fascination with science led him to excel in the local high school. When he turned 18, Mateo received a scholarship to study geology at a prestigious university in Monterrey, where his teachers and classmates were impressed for his dedication and charisma. His academic achievements, they did not take long to take him to advanced programs where he completed a master's degree and a doctorate in seismic studies for the outside world. Mateo was the perfect example of perseverance and success, a rising star in his field. However, what no one knew was that Mateo hid a dark and disturbing secret. something that slowly began to emerge during his university years. In his second year in Monterrey, Mateo decided to share a house with other students to save expenses. It was a spacious and old house with high ceilings and separate rooms that housed 5 tenants, men and women. One of her housemates, Anna, would remember years later her initial impression of Mateo. He always made everyone laugh. His humor was strange, but no one considered him offensive. One night, while they were having dinner together in the kitchen, Mateo made a comment that Anna would never forget. He joked about installing an Ulta camera in the bathroom to record comical moments. The others took it as an absurd occurrence, but Anna remembered that her smile was not that of someone who was simply playing. Although she did not give it more importance at that moment, something in her felt uneasy. What none of the tenants knew was that Mateo had already installed a camera in the shared bathroom. Every time someone used the place, he watched from his laptop in the private room of his room. Over time, this behavior became more sinister. Technology and access to the internet offered Mateo a new world of possibilities. It was in 2012 when he discovered a dark side of the network, a place where anonymity was the rule and social norms disappeared. Fascinated, Mateo began to frequent forums on the deep web using a software called Rio that allowed him to navigate without a trace. At first his curiosity was limited to exploring. However, he soon fell into the most macabre corners. In those places, not only graphic videos were shared, but also methods to manipulate and exploit others. Mateo, with his brilliant intellect and his calculating personality, did not take long to adopt these practices, using them to extend his control over those around him. In 2014, Mateo took his obsession a step further. While exploring anonymous forums, he stumbled upon publications that described psychological manipulation techniques. It was in those spaces where he began to create false identities. His first attempt was simple. He pretended to be a young photography enthusiast who was looking for models for artistic projects. Under this disguise, he managed to convincing several people, mainly young women, to send him initially harmless personal photographs. Upon receiving the images, Mateo began his game, slowly revealed his true identity, making it clear that he no longer had the intention of keeping the promise of an artistic project. Instead, the photos became tools of blackmail. He threatened to share them, and his victims did not follow in each of his orders. It was in that same year when he contacted under the pseudonym from Sofia to a teenager from a small town in Durango. The young woman was looking for opportunities to earn some money and help her family. Mateo, pretending to be an art student of the same age, started a conversation apparently friendly. Little by little he gained her trust until he convinced her to send him photographs under the excuse of a human portrait project. When he had enough material, Mateo changed the tone of his messages. He confessed that she was not the one who was thirsty, and that if she did not obey her demands, the images would be sent to her family and friends. The young woman, terrified and feeling completely trapped, gave herself to her demands. Among the first orders that Mateo gave her, there was a particularly humiliating and degrading one that forced her to perform it in a public place. The crying girl complied. From that moment on, Mateo's demands they became more and more twisted to in the daily newspaper. The young woman received messages with new tasks. Mateo seemed to enjoy the control he exercised over her. Recounting his experience in dark forums where other users commented on his ability to manipulate his victims, his goal was not only to obtain material, he wanted to break the young woman completely, reduce her to a state of desperation from which she could not escape. The teenager tried on several occasions to end the harassment, begged Mateo to he left her alone, promising that he would not tell anyone. However, this only goaded him more. On one occasion, when the young woman suggested that she could not continue, he sent her screenshots showing that she had already shared some of the photos on internet forums. He also warned her that if she tried to ask for help, he would make sure that the images reached her family directly. The girl's life began to fall apart. His grades began to fall apart. She distanced herself from her friends and stopped talking to her family. Every message that arrived was a threat that hung over her like an idle shadow. Meanwhile, Mateo continued his daily routine as a researcher at the university, projecting the image of a charismatic and impeccable young man for years. This double life allowed him to continue with his crimes without raising suspicion. But what Mateo did not know was that his obsession with documenting every detail of his abuses would eventually be oversight. While Mateo continued to perfect his sinister network of manipulators, he began to increase the complexity of his activities using various false identities. Not only did he seek out new victims, But he also infiltrated digital communities that shared twisted interests similar to his own in these spaces. Matteo was not a simple observer. He became an active participant, exchanging advice, sharing methods, and boasting of his achievements with other users. It was in those forums that Matteo created a kind of manual. This document compiled in detail the tactics he used to identify and manipulate his victims, described how to gain their trust, how to keep them trapped through blackmail, and how to hide digital traces that could lead to their identification. Although it was never discovered how many users accessed this manual, subsequent investigations would reveal in which its content he had a devastating impact, inspiring others to replicate his methods at some point between 2015 and 2016. Matteo expanded his activities by contacting people of different ages and nationalities. Authorities would later discover that he used around 30 different identities to approach his victims, each identity being meticulously designed, with stories and details that made it difficult to question. Some of their identities were friendly young people, while others were friendly, pretended to be authority figures to intimidate and manipulate. Among the victims who most impacted the researchers was a young woman who had recently graduated from college who had published an art portfolio online. Matteo, posing as a curator at a prestigious gallery, contacted her and offered her the opportunity to exhibit her work at a fictional event through weeks of email exchanges. Personal, including photographs. When he finally revealed his true intentions, the woman was devastated. Despite being older and more experienced, he also fell into his net, feeling that he had no way to escape. In the background of these activities, Matteo continued with his life apparently normal. He published academic research, attended conferences, and participated in university projects. Those who knew him described him as brilliant and sympathetic, unable to imagine that behind from that facade was hidden a methodical and unscrupulous manipulator. However, the mistakes began to accumulate. One of his victims, tired of the constant threats, decided to seek help. Although at first he feared that no one would believe him, he contacted an organization dedicated to the protection of vulnerable people on the internet. This was the first step that triggered a broader investigation through cooperation between international agencies and cybersecurity experts. They were identified patterns in Matteo's activities. Investigators tracked down communications and digital ions that linked the multiple identities used. It was then that they began to piece together the puzzle, revealing the scale of the crimes committed by Matteo and the network of abuse that had built. The fence closed around Matteo over several months. The authorities, after analyzing the digital traces he had left, managed to identify the locations from which he operated, although he had taken numerous precautions to remain anonymous. Small inconsistencies in his digital movements allowed cybersecurity experts to track his activity. It was in late 2017 when undercover agents managed to infiltrate one of the forums that Matteo frequented using fake identities, posing as users interested in his methods. This allowed them to collect crucial evidence, including direct communications in which Matteo boasted of his accomplishments. The international operation involved multiple agencies, all collaborating to make sure he couldn't escape. On the day of his arrest, Matteo was in his university office working on a project seemingly harmless. Police arrived unannounced, confiscating computers, storage devices, and documents. The brilliant investigator's public face crumbled in seconds as authorities read the charges against him. The case shocked not only to the university, but also to the entire academic and scientific community. No one could believe that someone with such an impeccable track record was behind such heinous crimes, yet the evidence was irrefutable. On the confiscated devices, hundreds of incriminating files of his interactions with the victims were found. During the trial, Matteo remained cold and distant. He showed little or no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. The testimonies of the victims were heartbreaking, revealing the extent of his cruelty and the psychological consequences left by his actions. Despite his defiant attitude, the accumulated evidence was too great to allow any defense. The sentence was exemplary. Matteo was sentenced to spend several decades in prison without the possibility of early release. The judge described him as someone with methodical and cruel behavior whose only intention was to inflict suffering on his victims. In addition to the removal of all materials related to his crimes and the implementation of measures to protect potential victims in the future, Matteo's case left a deep mark on the way internet safety and the prevention of online abuse were approached. For many, it became a grim reminder of how digital tools, when misused, can be a devastating weapon in the wrong hands. A cold night at the end of November, with the air permeated with the damp smell of dry leaves and the distant echo of some owl. Lonely Valeria, her boyfriend Adrian, and their two friends, Natalia and Eric, had decided to spend the weekend in an old family cabin of Valeria's, nestled deep in the Bosque de la Marquesa, on the outskirts of Toluca. The cabin that had once belonged to her grandparents had been in disuse for years, the furniture covered with white sheets and the creak of the old wood under her feet created the perfect setting for what Natalia called a night of terrifying stories. The cherry on the cake cannot be missing, Eric said with his characteristic mischievous smile as he took out a dark wooden board or pebble. The surface was full of letters and numbers carved with detail, and the pointer seemed to be worn out by years of use. "Where did you get that?" Valeria asked with a grimace of distrust. "I found her in my great-uncle's attic. She looks authentic." Eric shook the board dramatically. "Come on, it's just a game." Adrian placed a hand on Valeria's shoulder. It's okay. If not, it doesn't work." We laughed for a while, and with a sigh Valeria agreed to join the improvised circle they had formed on an old coffee table. Natalia lit a candle and placed it in the center of the table. The light oscillated, casting trembling shadows on the walls. "There is someone here with us tonight?" Eric asked in a theatrical voice. At first nothing happened. The pointer remained motionless under his fingers, and everyone exchanged uncomfortable glances. Then the pointer moved. He slowly slid across the table until he pointed to the word. "Yes." Valeria's stomach was. "He shrunk. Who's moving it?" He muttered. "I wasn't it," Natalia replied with a barely audible voice. "It's the subconscious, guys," Eric said with a nervous smile. "Let's go on." Adrian swallowed hard and asked, "What's your name?" The pointer began to move again, spelling out a word with firm and quick movements. Malachi, repeated Natalia with a frown. "Your kind." The pointer moved suddenly towards the silence, fell on them like a shroud. The candle flickered violently, and from somewhere in the forest came the distant howl of a coyote. Valeria withdrew her hand immediately. "We shouldn't be doing this," but Eric wasn't willing to stop, his eyes shining with excitement. He asked again, "Why are you here, Malachi?" The pointer saw quickly, this time spelling out a single word. "Trap, trap," Adrian repeated with a thread of voice. At that moment the candle went out. I added the waves in absolute darkness. The group was startled and turned on the flashlights of their phones. The haze of light created strange shapes on the walls of worn wood. Valeria backed her breath ragged. "Enough is enough," she said in a trembling voice. "This is not a game." Eric raised the pointer of the board, holding it between his fingers as if it were a trophy. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just wood, and painted letters are going to let a piece of board scares you." "Eric, enough," growled Adrian. "Early tomorrow we're leaving here." Valeria nodded, crossing her arms tightly after a brief exchange of glances. Natalia turned off her flashlight, and everyone went back to their rooms. But Valeria couldn't sleep. The silence of the forest seemed to be alive, pulsating with each of its heartbeats. The wood creaked and the wind blew faintly between the cracks of the windows. In the morning Valeria was the first to get up, and when she entered the room her heart stopped. The board heard. She was back on the table. The pointer rested on the word "to God." Adrian shouted. Valeria with a broken voice. One by one, the others left their rooms with sleepy eyes and pale faces. "Who touched this?" Valeria demanded. "Who took her out again?" No one answered. Eric laughed nervously. "Come on, who's playing with this?" But his eyes full of uncertainty betrayed his apparent tranquility. Then they heard him. An almost imperceptible whisper, like the wind sneaking through the cracks, but it wasn't the wind. It was coming from the board. Natalia let out a small scream. Taking several steps back, Valeria took the box of the Ouija and closed it tightly. Her hands were visibly shaking. "We're leaving," she said firmly. Right now. The group hurriedly packed their things and got into Adrian's old car. The engine roared, and soon they were moving slowly through the thick fog that covered the road. But then, when they made a sharp turn, Adrian suddenly stepped on the brake. Standing there in the middle of the road there was a man. He was tall, thin, and his skin had a grayish tone, almost translucent. His clothes were torn and full of mud. But the worst thing was his eyes, two dark wells that seemed to absorb the little light of dawn. "Cuke, that's what," Natalia murmured with a thread of voice. The man raised a hand slowly and pointed directly at Valeria. The car's engine suddenly went out. Adrian turned the key again and again, but the vehicle did not respond. The air inside the car became cold, and Valeria felt something icy and heavy pressing her chest. The man watched them for a moment more, and then without haste he turned around and walked towards the fog, disappearing into the mist. The engine roared again, and Adrian accelerated without looking back, leaving the cabin and the forest as a bad memory in the rearview mirror. The trip back to the city was a dense silence, barely broken by the murmur of the engine and the distant sound of the radio. That sputters with interference. Nobody I wanted to talk about what they had just seen. The shadows of the Sabbath stretched like fingers through the fog, and each shadow seemed to hide something that was watching them. When they arrived in Toluca, each one returned to their home without saying goodbye properly, as if breaking the silence could invoke something worse. Valeria entered her home feeling exhausted and with a tightness in her chest that did not leave her. Her parents were outside, so she had the house to herself. She left her backpack on the floor of the living room and went up to her room. When she closed the door, she felt a momentary relief, as if when she crossed the threshold she was leaving something behind. But that feeling faded quickly. That night Valeria could not sleep. Every little crack of the wood, every whistle of the wind between the windows seemed to her to be muffled voices around 3 o'clock in the morning. In the early hours of the morning, something woke her up suddenly. A sound barely audible like a whisper. Valeria sat down suddenly, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked around her room, but there was no one. With trembling hands, she turned on the night lamp. The warm light filled the room, dispelling the shadows a little. But then she saw him there, in the darkest corner of her room. There was the "No, it can't be," she whispered in a broken voice. She herself had seen how Adrian kept it in the trunk of the car before leaving the cabin. But there it was, with the pointer resting right on the letter V. Valeria quickly took it and ran to the backyard. Without thinking twice, threw the box inside an old metal box and set it on fire with a lighter. The flames rose quickly, illuminating her face. But instead of feeling relief, she felt something worse, the sensation of being watched. "Get out!" she screamed at the fire. "No, you are welcome here." The flames sizzled and for an instant seemed to form a distorted and deformed human face. Valeria recoiled in horror, and the fire finally went out, leaving only black ashes. The following days were no better. Natalia told her by message that she had begun to hear footsteps outside her window at night. Adrian had recurring nightmares where the man on the road appeared standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with those dark and empty eyes. Eric, for his part, had disappeared. He did not answer messages or calls, and his mother said that he had gone out one night and had not returned. Paranoia began to grow between them. Valeria began to notice shadows moving in the corners of her peripheral vision. The lights of her house flickered erratically, and the reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes seemed to move a second. After she did it one afternoon, while researching on the internet, Valeria showed a forum of people who had had similar experiences. A user with the name Nightwalker left a disturbing message: "No matter if you destroy the board, no matter if you run away, if you do not close correctly, the portal will remain open and what you called will find you." Valeria, he felt a lump in his throat. He knew what he had to do. "I have to go back," he whispered. That same night he called Adrian and Natalia. At first they refused, but Valeria's trembling voice and the reality of what they were living convinced them. "See you tomorrow in the cabin," Adrian said at the end of the call. At dawn the three friends were again in front of the entrance to the forest of La Marquesa. The fog, it was even thicker than last time, and the air was icy. The road to the cabin seemed longer and darker. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked different, older, more inclined, as if the forest was slowly absorbing it. The silence was absolute. Not even the birds could hear each other. "This doesn't feel right," said Natalia, hugging herself. Valeria took a handful of salt from her backpack, a jar of water, blessed, and a small Bible that her grandmother had given her when she was a child. "We can't sweat now," Valeria replied with a firm tone. When they entered the cabin, they found something that made them stop and dry. In the center of the room, the board was there intact with no signs of having been burned. The pointer rested on the word "Hello." "It can't be," Natalia exclaimed, stepping back towards the door. "It's as if we were," Adrian murmured. Valeria took a deep breath and advanced towards the board. "This time we will do it well. Let's close this." They formed a circle around the board. Valeria placed the salt, forming a perimeter around it, while Natalia held the Bible and Adrian had the jar of holy water ready. "Malachi," said Valeria in a firm voice, "we are here to close what we opened. No, you are welcome here. You have no power over us." The temperature in the room, he came down suddenly. His breath was visible in the air, and an invisible pressure seemed to be pushing him from all sides. The pointer began to move with frantic movements. "Stay mine." Valeria did not shout, "In the name of God, I order you to leave." Adrian threw holy water on the board, and Natalia began to read aloud a psalm from the Bible. The pointer vibrated, shook as if trying to escape from the board, and then everything stopped. The air became lighter. The pressure disappeared. and the silence reigned again in the cabin, but something was not right on the threshold of the door. A figure was watching them. It was him, the man on the road. His mouth moved, forming silent words that no one could understand, and then he simply disappeared into the fog. "We succeeded?" Natalia asked with tears in her eyes. Valeria looked at the board. The pointer rested on the word "to God." "I hope," he replied with a trembling sigh. The group left the cabin with a mixture of relief and terror still latent in their bodies. The cold air of the forest enveloped them, while the fog seemed to cling to their clothes as if trying to hold them back. None of them spoke as they walked back to the car. Only the rustling of the dry leaves under their feet broke the sepulchral silence. "They think it worked?" Natalia finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The board said goodbye." Adrian did not answer. "That means the portal is closed, right?" Valeria didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the path in front of them, but her mind was far away, lost in the memory of the dark figure that had watched them from the threshold. Something in her eyes, in that infinite blackness, was still stuck in her mind like an invisible hook. Finally they reached the car. Adrian turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared when it started. It seemed a sign, a confirmation that the worst was behind him. Without looking back, Adrian stepped on the accelerator and the forest began to slowly fade in the rearview mirror. Back in their homes, each one tried to resume their normal lives. But what they had experienced in that cabin was like a shadow that followed him wherever they went. Natalia barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard her sorrows, coming from impossible places. Adrian, he became more and more paranoid, feeling that someone was watching him from the mirrors of his house, and Valeria began to notice things that he could not explain. Lights that flickered just when he entered a room, objects that appeared in places where he had not left them. But the worst were dreams. Every night he dreamed of the cabin, with the dark corridors and the smell of damp wood, and in each dream he was there, the man on the road with his gray skin and black eyes, standing in a corner, staring at her. One night, after waking up screaming for the third time in a row, Valeria made a decision. "I can't go on like this," she whispered with trembling hands. This didn't end. She didn't really dial Adrian's number. "We need to talk." The three friends met at Valeria's house. The next day Natalia looked thinner and paler, and Adri didn't. "I stopped looking at the corners of the room as if I expected to see something move in the shadows." This didn't end. "Valeria, finally, I'm sorry. You feel it too, right?" They both nodded almost in unison. "In the forum I read," Valeria continued, "they said that sometimes, even if you close the portal, the entity stays. It clings to you if you invoked it directly, and I think that's what happened with us." "So what?" "I don't know," Valeria replied, "but there is someone who might know." She took out her phone and showed a name on the screen. "Donna Ramona, a spiritual medium. My grandmother mentioned her. Sometimes she said that she helped people when things like that happened." Withered plants. When they arrived, the door opened slowly as if they were waiting for them. An old woman with white hair tied up in a bun and a dark shawl covering her shoulders looked at them with tired but penetrating eyes, passed by and was waiting for them. The interior of the house was full of candles, religious statuettes and symbols carved in wood. The air smelled of incense and fresh herbs. "What brings them here?" asked Donna Ramona. Her tone suggested that she already knew. Valeria took the floor and told her everything, from the Ouija to the figure on the road and the strange events they had experienced since then. Donna Ramona listened in silence, with her hands clasped on her lap, finally spoke. "They have done something very dangerous. The spirit they invoked is not just any wandering soul, Malachi. It is not a name, it is a title. It is a being that does not belong to this world, and now it is tied to you. We can break that link?" Adrian asked. The old woman nodded slowly. "Yes, but it will not be easy. You must return to the place where it all began, to the cabin, and this time you must close the link definitively. You cannot hesitate. You cannot show fear. If you do, he will claim you." "How do we do it?" Valeria asked in a firm voice. Donna Ramona gave them a black cloth bag that had contained blessed salt, coal, a hand-carved wooden cross, and a small red candle. They must form a circle with the salt and coal around the board, light the candle and hold the cross. They must command with all their willpower that the spirit return to the place from which it came, and they must say the right words. "I command you, in the name of light and truth, to return to the abyss from which you came out here. You have no power. No, you are welcome." "And if it doesn't work?" Natalia asked with a broken voice. Donna Ramona looked her straight in the eyes. "There is no room for error. If none of you fail." The group exchanged looks full of fear but also determination. They knew that there was no other option. "When should we do it?" Adrian asked this very night, Donna Ramona replied. The longer he passes, the stronger he will be and the less they will have a chance of surviving back in the car. The group was silent. The darkness was already falling on Toluca and the road to the cabin seemed even more threatening than before. If something goes wrong, Natalia began. Nothing is going to go wrong, Valeria interrupted. Firmly, we are going to finish this together. The car advanced slowly along the cobblestone road while the fog covered the forest again like a blanket of death. The cabin I waited in the gloom. The windows looked like empty eyes, and the air was charged with an invisible presence. Now or never, he whispered. The group got out of the car and walked to the door with the bags of salt and sacred objects in their hands. As they crossed the threshold, the smell of rot hit them squarely, and in the center of the room, as if it had been waiting for them all this time, the board Ouija rested on the table with the pointer pointing directly at my word. The air inside the cabin was thick, heavy, as if each particle were saturated with an invisible and malevolent presence. The group remained motionless in front of the board Ouija, where the pointer continued to point to my word with an intention. Clara, almost mocking. We have to do it now, whispered Valeria with her knuckles white from so much. Squeezing the wooden cross in, Adrian nodded and began to draw a circle around the board with the salt and coal. Following Donna Ramona's directions, Natalia lit the small red candle, its flame trembling, as if she were aware of the danger around them. Don't leave the circle, no matter what, Valeria said, her voice trembling but determined. The group knelt around the board forming a triangle. Valeria took the cross with both hands, Natalia held the candle, and Adrian held the jar of holy water near Malachi. Valeria said firmly, in the name of light and truth, I order you to return to the abyss from which you came out here. You have no power. You are not welcome. The pointer began to tremble. Then with a sudden movement he shot off the board and hit the wall. Astle. On impact, don't stop. Okay. Adri, while his hands trembled, I order you to come back, continued Valeria with more force. No, you are welcome in this world. An icy wind began to whip the interior of the cabin. The windows vibrated, and the furniture creaked under an invisible pressure. The shadows on the walls began to lengthen, twisting, as if they had a life of their own. Birth began to, but did not let go of the candle. Say the words with me, shouted Valeria. We command you in the name of the light and the truth. Go back to the abyss from which you came out here. You have no power. You are not welcome, they repeated in unison. A deafening roar filled the cabin. A guttural and heartbreaking sound that seemed to come from everywhere and from none at once. The lights of the telephones went out and the candle flickered dangerously in the darkest corner of the room. Something began to materialize. It was him, Malachi. His tall and thin silhouette stood tall with a presence impossible to ignore. Her gray skin seemed to stretch over her bones, and her eyes, those empty and dark eyes, were like bottomless wells that devoured the little light that was in the room. Do not break the circle, Valeria shouted desperately. The entity took a step towards them and the ground creaked under her feet. She raised a bony hand and pointed directly at Natalia. She did not shout. Retreating into the circle, the wind increased, the walls vibrated as if they were going to collapse, and a smell of sulfur began to fill the air. Hold on, Adrian shouted, pouring holy water at the figure. The liquid sparkled when it touched it, and the entity roared in pain. Retreating a few steps, Valeria took advantage of that moment and raised the wooden cross above her head. In the name of God, I expel you. In the name of light, I order you to leave, Malachi. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out of it. It was an abyss, an absolute void. The ground trembled beneath them and Natalia's candle exploded in a spark of red light. For a moment everything froze, the wind, the noises, the shadows, even time seemed to have stopped. Then Malachi began to slowly fade away, as if her form was being sucked into an invisible void. Her eyes were still fixed on Valeria, full of an unfathomable hatred, until finally the silence fell on the hut like a marble slab. The only light that could be found was the faint glow of the cross in Valeria's hands. She left, Natalia whispered with tears running down her cheeks. Adri looked around with a pale face. I don't know, but wind more. Valeria let out a trembling sigh and dropped the cross to the ground. The group stood there, kneeling in the circle of salt, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened at dawn. The group walked out from the cabin. The air was fresh and clean, and the fog was beginning to dissipate with the first rays of the sun. For the first time in days, they felt they could breathe. Before leaving, Valeria took the board Ouija, sprinkled it with holy water, and burned it in an improvised fire. This time the flames were not blue, nor were screams heard in the distance. Only ashes, never again, Valeria whispered as she looked at the last fragments of wood burning. The way back was silent, but this time it was not a heavy silence. It was silence of peace. The forest seemed different, less oppressive, less dark. Weeks passed, and little by little life returned to normal. Natalia began to sleep peacefully. Adrian stopped feeling afraid when he saw himself in the mirrors, and Valeria no longer heard whispers at night. The cabin was completely closed. None of them came back to step on that place, however. On the full moon, some hikers who go too far into the forest of the Marquise say that if you listen carefully, you can hear a whisper among the trees, a whisper that carries a single message from me, but of course, they are just stories. Oh no, if you got this far, write secret in the comments. My name is Luis, and this is the story of what happened in my school when I was in high school. This happened in the 2000s in a public school in a small town in the interior of Mexico. It was a different time. Without smartphones or social media as popular as they are today, I was an ordinary young man like any other teenager. I had my friends, we played soccer on the school field, and I worried more about exams and mischief than anything else. Life went on as normal with that routine of classes, homework, and plans for the weekend. The school where we studied was old, with those exposed brick buildings and wide corridors that gave it a gloomy air, especially on rainy days, when natural light barely entered. Classes were a mixture of boring subjects and others that we liked, depending on the teacher. Some teachers were very friendly, others not so much. The life of an ordinary student, nothing out of the ordinary. It was in the middle of that routine when the first indications that something strange was happening began to appear. It all started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Some classrooms had a strange feeling, as if something invisible was present. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was not right. At first we thought it was just paranoia, something that our mind played on us being in such an old school, full of stories and rumors. But then the situation became more serious. It was a Wednesday morning when I felt it for the first time. I was sitting in math class. The teacher was talking about equations, but I couldn't concentrate. There was something in the air, a cold that didn't make sense, because it was hot outside. I looked around and saw that I wasn't the only one who was in the middle of it. Mariana, who sat in front of me, seemed restless, constantly moving in her chair at recess. I commented with Pedro and Lucas about that strange feeling. They laughed, saying that I was exaggerating. But then, while we were playing soccer on the field, Pedro mentioned that in history class he had felt something similar. He said that it seemed that someone was watching him, but when he turned around there was no one. From there we began to lend more attention. Every day there was something new. One day, the closet in the room smelled opened by itself. Another day, in the library, the books fell off the shelves without anyone touching them. They were small things, but they started to make our hair stand on end. One day Monica came to school pale with deep dark circles under her eyes. I asked her if she was okay, and she just shrugged her shoulders, saying that she hadn't slept well during class. He began to stare at the door as if he saw something there. When I asked him what it was, he said he thought he saw a shadow moving. The headmistress, Mrs. Marlin, tried to quell the rumors by saying that it was all a figment of our imagination, that the school was old and so it made strange noises. But we knew there was something else, that feeling, that knot in the stomach. It was too real to be alone. Paranoia. Back then we were more worried about the exams and the jokes than the ghosts. But what started as little things grew, and that's when Monica started acting strange. If she had known what was going to happen next, maybe she would have done something different. Maybe she would have talked to more people, told my parents. But the truth is, we were just a bunch of teenagers trying to understand what was going on, and then things started to get out of control. The next week Monica started skipping classes. When she appeared, she was different, distracted, as if she were in another world. Her eyes had a strange glow, and she said nonsensical things as if she was daydreaming during geography class. Suddenly she got up and went to the corner of the room, staring at the wall. The teacher tried to call her, but she didn't seem to hear it. At recess, I went to talk to her. I asked her if she was okay, but she just shook her head and said something about them coming that gave me goosebumps. Who were they? I tried to ask more, but she walked away, looking over my shoulder like I saw someone behind me. When I turned to look, there was no one. Things got worse. A Friday, we were in biology class when Monica started shaking. At first I thought she was sick, but soon she started screaming. They were desperate, high-pitched screams that echoed all over the hallway. We were all left in shock, not knowing what to do. Monica contorted on the floor as if something was trying to come out of her. The teacher and some students tried to hold her, but she seemed to have superhuman strength. It was then that she started to speak in a language that no one understood. with a voice that didn't seem like hers. Her eyes turned completely white. It was a terrifying scene. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she fainted. They called an ambulance and took Monica to the hospital. We stayed at school trying to understand what had just happened. No one knew what to say, she asked. We told the teachers and even the principal, but they seemed not to be able to do so. They said that Monica had had an episode and that soon it would be fine, but no one really believed it in the following days. We tried to find out what had happened to Monica, but she never came back to school. At that time we had no other way to contact her outside of school, so we didn't know what had happened. The headmistress forbade any discussion on the subject, saying it was for everyone's good. Until to this day, I don't know what happened to her. After I graduated from high school, I moved to another city to enter college, and I lost contact with all my classmates from that time. That was the scariest experience I have ever lived. I am sure that Monica was possessed by someone or by something. She used to work as a nanny for a woman named Carla, who always left me with the feeling that I should spend more time with her children instead of hiring me. Carla had 3 children, 2 small ones and an older girl, all from her marriage to her ex-husband. Although I didn't know many details, I knew that she had one custody, which made me think that her ex must be much worse for her to be the most viable option. Don't get me wrong, Carla loved her children. I never saw signs of abuse. However, she was always absent. It was common for her to party, drink, and not come home all night. Many times she woke up at a boyfriend's house. My friends didn't understand why I kept working for her, but the answer was simple. I was paid well and the children were lovely. I didn't want to leave them too. One night at the end of August, Carla went out again. She knew it would be a long night like many others. Everything was quiet until 6 p.m. when I heard a knock on the door. When I opened, I recognized the man in front of me. It was Carla's ex-husband. I had never met him in person, but I had seen photos of him. I knew that he was not allowed to see the children without judicial supervision. I can enter to see my children, he asked with a nervous smile. I flatly refused. When I insisted, I replied that it was none of his business where I was. Carla, and that I was just the babysitter, continued to try to convince me, claiming that at least he wanted to be with his children. While Carla was surely partying, I kept my stance. Finally he gave up and left. I tried to communicate with Carla, but her cell phone went straight to voicemail. I decided not to worry too much and continue with my routine. Normally I put the children to bed at 88:30, but that night a storm started before time. The thunder scared the little ones, so I let them stay in the living room watching TV with me. Hours passed while My Little Pony filled the room with bright colors and catchy songs. At 9 p.m., I noticed lights from a car in the driveway. At first I thought it was Carla coming back early. However, my theory fell apart when I heard the sound of glass breaking. The children screamed and they ran to the other end of the room. I looked at the door and saw a miraculous hand holding a cross key with which I had broken the small window by the door. Although it wasn't big enough to get in, the man was trying to reach the knob from outside. Panic hit me like lightning. I had to decide quickly: call the police or stop him from opening the door. Luckily for me, the older girl Andrea ran for the phone and dialed 911 without being asked. While she was talking to the operators, I decided to confront the intruder. The man was clearly furious, shouting insults and threats. He claimed that he would hurt me if I did not let him in. Near the door there was a poker from the fireplace. I took him, ran to the entrance and hit his hand with all my strength. The blow made him withdraw his hand while he continued screaming. The poker unfortunately did not hold and broke in two among the thunder of the storm. I heard sirens approaching. The man too, he heard cursing. He left, got into his car and disappeared. Minutes later the police arrived at the house. After listening to my story and making sure that the children were okay, they went out in search of him. It didn't take long to find his car in front of a nearby bar. He was arrested that same night. The agents talked to Carla for a long time. The next day, I don't know exactly what they discussed, but what I do know is that little after the family moved, I never took care of those children again. But before I left, they gave me hugs and words that I will always carry in my heart. Sometime later they called me to testify against the man. He was finally sentenced to prison. Although it was a terrifying experience, it comforts me to know that those little ones were safe that night. What happened continues to haunt you. I decided to enroll in a local university located in the heart of this community. What I did not know at the time was that the city had just gone through one of the worst waves of crime that had been seen in years. Although it was not a place where violence was common, the situation had left everyone deeply disturbed. My grandparents lived in that city, and it was with them that I stayed with when I arrived. I remember to my grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran, sitting at his desk until the wee hours of the morning with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a gun in the other. The sense of security he had always felt disappeared after recent events, and my grandfather returned to his survival instincts. The city was in SOC, and I, being new, did not fully understand what had occurred. However, the stories began to reach my ears, and I soon found myself involved in the details of a crime that would change my perception of life in that small town. 3 young men, whom I will call Luis, Rodrigo, and Ernesto, were known in the community for being troublesome. 18 years old was the oldest, while Rodrigo and Ernesto were just 15 and 16 years old. Although their antics did not seem so serious with him, their behavior began. The people of the place knew them well, and when something bad happened, it was not uncommon for their names to be mentioned. These 3 boys, in their immaturity, were convinced that they should flee the city. They began to commit small night robberies to raise money and what they considered necessary for their escape. In one of these robberies, Luis got a gun, and it was at that moment when his sense of invulnerability intensified. They thought that with that weapon they could achieve anything, and in a span of 72 hours after obtaining it, they were involved in an act that would mark their lives forever. That night, the 3 decided to break into the house of an elderly couple, the Herreras, with the intention of stealing everything that had value. They did not expect to find them sleeping in their bed, but now that they had a weapon, they felt prepared for anything. When Don Roberto, the owner of the house, got out of bed to confront them, one of the boys pulled the trigger without hesitation. Don Roberto fell to the ground dead instantly, while his wife, Dona Marta, watched horrified from the bed. Reality hit the young people with the force of a wave. They had committed a murder and knew that there was no escape. Without a clear plan and without means to get out of the city, they tried to hide, but were captured in less than 24 hours. The investigation was swift and forceful, and all 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment. Although it was later rumored that Rodrigo and Ernesto's sentences had been reduced, Luis, who had fired the gun, did not have the same luck. Despite the seriousness of what happened, life in the city continued. Although with a shadow of fear and mistrust, Roberto's murder, it shook the community in a way it had never experienced before. Residents who were previously confident and carefree began to live cautiously, always alert to what might happen. The university, which had once been a place of joy and learning, was filled with palpable attention. Students and faculty were visibly affected, and we all looked at each other with suspicion. It is tense and distrustful energy. It persisted throughout over time. The city began to recover some of its old peace, but the memory of what happened always remained latent. The 3 boys, especially Luis, were known in the community, and knowing that someone who had once been part of that place had committed such an atrocious act was difficult to accept. He had been a young man with a promising life, a lover of the outdoors and the rodeo. While Rodrigo and Ernesto also had their own interests, but mutual influence and lack of guidance led them down a dark path. The consequences of their decisions were felt not only in their lives, but in the entire community. To this day, the city remains a peaceful place, but Don Roberto's murder is a constant reminder of how a series of bad decisions can change everything, even though time has been lost. It seems like yesterday when it all happened, and although we have had other minor incidents since then, nothing has shaken the city in the same way. The story of Luis, Rodrigo, and Ernesto is a tragedy, an example of how youth and immaturity, when not guided correctly, can lead to a fatal fate in that small town in Mexico. Their story is told as a warning. It was a warm night in August 1996 on the deserted highways of northern Sonora. Jack, an experienced middle-aged truck driver, was driving on the lonely Highway 2, an endless stretch that connected the border to the interior of the country. It was a familiar path to him, but that night there was something different in the air. The darkness was thicker than ever, and the silence of the desert enveloped everything, as if the whole world had decided to sleep at the same time. In the distance, a bright light appeared on the horizon. At first Jack thought it could be a lost truck or a vehicle that needed help. However, as the light grew, he realized that it could not be something ordinary. It was not a lighthouse light or a reflection of the stars. It was a dazzling glow that seemed to expand and contract like a kind of intrigued and somewhat worried pulse. Jack slowed down his truck. He didn't know what attracted him more, the desire to investigate or the need to avoid something strange that lurked in the darkness. With a sigh, he turned off the radio and concentrated on the road, trying to discern what was happening as the light approached. It began to take shape as if it were a figure, not an object or vehicle. He couldn't believe what he saw. It was a thin and tall figure, much taller than any human being could reach, with luminous skin that seemed to reflect light in an unusual way. His large and dark eyes did not reflect anything of the surroundings, only a metallic glow as if they were dark mirrors. Jack stopped the truck, but he did not move, but his eyes seemed to be fixed on him, inviting him to come closer. A shiver ran down Jack's spine. He felt something telling him that he must perish there, that he must suddenly observe a soft voice, and Clara penetrated directly into his mind. He did not hear a whisper, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere and from all sides. None at the same time was a calm but at the same time authoritative voice, as if someone was speaking to him in a familiar but mysterious language. "Don't be afraid," the voice told him as if reading his thoughts. He tried to move his body, but he felt completely paralyzed, as if the figure had blocked his will. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move a finger. "Everything is fine. Just observe and understand the figure," raised a hand or something. Although his fingers were elongated and his skin glowed in the dark, Jack watched as the figure moved his hand towards the truck, and at that moment the air seemed to become denser as if it was being altered by an invisible force. The figure began to walk towards him, gliding across the ground with unearthly grace. With each step he took, the air around him began to vibrate, and he felt a strange pressure build up in his chest. The stars seemed to fade away, as if the entire universe was shutting down to focus solely on that presence. Little by little the figure began to examine the truck. At first Jack thought he was seeing things, but soon realized that something was really happening. The figure was not touching the truck, but his movements seemed to affect the environment, as if he was collecting something invisible from the air. Extending his hands toward the vehicle, the particles in the air moved as if they were attracted to the entity, and Jack could see how they accumulated around it like dust shining under the moonlight. He did not understand what was happening, but something told him that he should stay still, that he should observe and at the same time understand that he could not do anything to change what was happening. The figure, as if he knew what he was thinking, suddenly stopped and looked directly at him. With those dark eyes at that moment Jack felt a fear as off-world as he had ever experienced before, a fear that did not come from what he saw but from what he could not comprehend. The figure remained motionless in front of the truck, watching Jack with that penetrating gaze as if he were analyzing him. Undressing every corner of his mind, Jack tried to react, but something kept him trapped, paralyzed without being able to move a single muscle. The voice in his mind returned clearer and deeper, this time almost as if it resonated within him. "You have no need to fear." Despite the reassuring words, a shiver ran through Jack's body, a primitive fear that made him feel as if he were facing something that did not belong to this world, something that neither reason nor experience could explain. The pressure in his chest increased, and for a moment he thought he was going to faint. But what happened next ripped any rational thought out of him. The figure raised his hands, and at that instant the air around the truck vibrated with such intensity that Jack felt as if reality itself were altering. A flash of light so bright that he could hardly bear it, it enveloped the road, and the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only a trail of energy floating in the air. The feeling of disorientation was instantaneous when Jack finally could move his eyes. Everything around him had changed. The road that once stretched straight towards the horizon now seemed to be bent as if time itself had been manipulated. The sound of the wind had completely disappeared. There was not a single whisper. It was as if the world had been suspended in an eerie silence. He was alone in the middle of the desert, and the truck was still on. But something was not right. The figure had disappeared, but something had changed in the air, something intangible, as if it was charged with an energy alien to everything he knew. Jack tried to start the engine, but the truck did not respond. Fear took hold of him again, and with a quick movement he tried to turn off the lights and get out of there as quickly as possible. But his body felt as if he was trapped in an invisible spider's web. After a few minutes his eyes began to blur. He felt an unbearable pressure in his head, as if something was pressing his mind. Then everything vanished into complete darkness. He didn't know how long he was out of yes. But when he woke up he was back inside his truck, sitting in the driver's seat. The engine roared softly, and the cabin was warm as if nothing had happened. But something didn't fit when he looked out the window. Jackvio, who was no longer in the same place, The road, once straight and open, now curved strangely, and the horizon that once seemed so far away was now much closer. Moreover, on the ground a few meters from the truck, something caught his attention. A perfectly delineated burnt circle was on the ground with a triangular pattern in the center. The ground around the circle was blackened as if something had happened. Of great heat would have touched the earth, leaving an indelible mark. Jack did not understand what that was, but his instinct told him that it should not be there. He tried to concentrate, but fear overwhelmed him. He had been asleep all that time. It was possible that all that experience was the product of a delirium or a blow to the head. He did not know it. The only thing he could do was to get away from there as quickly as possible, feeling dizzy and stunned. Jack started the engine again and began to drive along the road. The burnt circle disappeared little by little in the rearview mirror, but the feeling of not leaving him alone, his body trembled. His mind processed the images and sounds with difficulty, and his heart beat wildly. He no longer knew if what he had lived was real or a nightmare, but the only thing he could do was get out of that on the road. As he moved forward, he saw lights in the distance, the first signs of life he had encountered. For miles the road was beginning to show signs of, but for Jack all that was irrelevant. Fear kept haunting him, a feeling that he couldn't shake, as if an invisible shadow was stalking him, waiting to catch him again. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Jack arrived at a small town. However, the first thing he did was to park to the side and close his eyes, trying to calm his mind. He needed to talk to someone, tell what had happened, but who no one would believe knew it well. The stories of encounters with strange beings were just that. Stories. No one was willing to listen to a truck driver who claimed to have witnessed something impossible. Jack got out of the truck with trembling legs, and as he walked to a nearby store, he looked up at the sky. The stillness of the night surrounded him, but something was still disturbing his mind. At that moment he saw a light in the sky. It was not like the other lights in the village, nor those of the vehicles. It was a bright point of light moving erratically in the sky. This is not over, he thought, his heart beating his chest, while the feeling of being watched invaded him again. Jack returned to his truck without the sight of that small light suspended in the air disturbed him deeply, but he couldn't stop looking at it. As he made his way toward the village tent, the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. Every step he took, he felt as if he were being stalked by something invisible. Anxiety gnawed at him, and the air around him seemed heavier than normal. He went into the store, but the atmosphere there was not much more comforting. The few inhabitants inside did not seem to notice the strange tension that filled the air. However, Jack could not shake the feeling that something was not right when an older-looking man approached the counter. He looked at him curiously. Jack tried to hide his discomfort, but the truth was that he did not know how to explain what had happened. Lived that night, no one would believe him. No one could understand him. How about friend? What time did you arrive on this side of the desert? The man asked him, still looking at an old magazine. Recently he came from a long route, Jack replied, trying to stay calm. I've had a strange experience. I don't know if you deserve. The man, he looked at him over his glasses, nodding slowly, as if he'd heard that same phrase many times before. I'm not from here, but I've heard things, said the man, putting down the magazine. They tell strange stories about this road. Something's not right in these deserts, but if you talk about it, they'll take you for crazy. Jack frowned, trying to process what he'd just heard. Strange stories? What kind of stories? The man looked at the door, making sure no one was listening. Then in a low voice, people said that he's seen lights in the sky, strange figures near the road. Some say there are marks on the ground, burnt circles like the ones you described, but much bigger, and when people pass by, something strange happens to them. Some don't come back. A shiver ran down Jack's spine. The man continued, a few months ago, a family passed by. They didn't talk much, but the father approached a policeman into the village, said he saw something near a field, something big, something that didn't seem out of this world. No one read it. Then the family left and they were never seen again. Jack, who was in SOC, knew that something strange had happened that night, but the man's words confirmed that he was not alone in his experience. Something bigger, something deeper was happening in that remote area of the desert, something that no human being could fully comprehend. And the circles, have you seen one? Jack asked, his voice tense. The man nodded slowly. Yes, but I haven't been the only one. I've seen marks in the fields, in secluded places. No one knows who makes them, and some say there's something in the air, something that changes the way you see the world. Jack nodded, taking in the information. He felt more distressed than ever. But now he understood that what he had experienced that night was not a hallucination or a bad dream. Something was happening in that desert, something that defied logic and reason. You could no longer ignore it. The voice in his mind suddenly returned, soft and firm as before, but this time more distorted, as if it were transmitted from afar. It is no longer alone. Jack looked around, but he did not see anything out of the ordinary. However, the dread grew inside him. Something else was about to happen, something he couldn't control. He decided he had to get out of there. He didn't want to be in that town or near that road anymore. He quickly left the store and returned to his truck with the feeling that the air was denser than normal. While he started the engine, a strange feeling of déjà vu invaded him. As if everything he had already lived through it would have happened before. As if he were caught in an endless cycle with his heart racing. Jack started the truck and started driving, going down the road again, aimlessly, just looking to get out of that place. However, it didn't matter how many miles he traveled. The feeling of being followed didn't disappear. The strange lights in the sky continued to appear, always in the distance, always lurking from the horizon. The next day Jack didn't. Some say that he never returned home, that he abandoned the life of a truck driver. Others say that they saw him once again in a looking at the sky with a lost expression in their eyes. No one knows for sure what happened to it, but the burnt circles in the fields keep popping up as a reminder that something strange, something that doesn't belong to this world, is still lurking in the desert nights and the townspeople. Even if they don't say it out loud, avoid traveling at night because they know that if you look hard enough at the sky you could see something that you are not prepared to understand. My name is Kayla, and since I was young I knew that I wanted to work to earn my own money and have my things. I started working as a nanny at the age of 14. I always liked to take care of children, and my parents thought it would be a great way to learn responsibility. Over time I became someone trusted by several families in my community. But there was an experience that marked my life forever. Everything happened one summer when I agreed to take care of Sophia, a 5-year-old girl in a quiet neighborhood north of Mexico City. Her parents, both doctors, worked long hours in the hospital and needed someone to take care of her until they returned at night. The house, it was big, cozy, surrounded by leafy trees, and on a quiet street where the silence at dusk was almost absolute. That day we had spent playing in the garden, reading stories and drawing. When the sun began to set, we entered the house while Sophia was playing with her dolls in the living room. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The sky was orange and the evening light filtered through the windows, creating a warm atmosphere. Everything seemed perfect until I heard the doorbell. I was not expecting anyone, so I approached cautiously. Looking through the peephole, I saw a middle-aged man. His face was drenched in sweat and he had a nervous expression. I shuddered to see him stagger slightly. "Who is he?" I asked, trying to sound firm. "I'm a friend of the family. I just wanted to know if everything is okay." He replied, something in his tone. I wasn't convinced. His eyes were glassy and there was something unsettling in his voice. I decided not to open the door. "Sophia's parents are not at home. She must return later," I said, hoping she would leave. However, she insisted. Her voice became more urgent. "Please, I need to come in. It's important." She started banging on the door hard from a side window. I saw her hands tremble and her eyes moved frantically. I felt a knot in my stomach. I called Sophia's parents, but they didn't answer. "I'm sorry, but I can't leave." I went in, I repeated. The knocks became more violent. Sophia appeared in the kitchen, hugging my leg. Her eyes were full of fear. "What's wrong?" Kayla asked in a trembling voice. "Nothing. Heaven, everything's fine," I replied, trying to sound calm. I hugged Sophia while the man kept banging on the door, screaming something I didn't understand. My hands were shaking as I tried to call the police. It was then that I heard a loud bang. The sound of splintered wood made me laugh. The man had managed to force the door froze. Sophia took Sophia in her arms and ran to the back of the house. We hid in a small closet in the hallway. I closed the door and whispered to Yes, "We have to be quiet." "Okay." She felt tears in her eyes. Her little body was shaking and I could barely control mine. Outside, I heard the man's footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. He opened doors and searched the house. It was getting closer and closer. Finally, I heard him approaching the closet. I held my breath. The door burst open and I saw him. His silhouette was silhouetted against the light in the hallway. I prepared for the worst, but at that moment a scream resounded from the entrance. "Police, hands up!" The man turned and ran to the front door from the closet. I heard a brief struggle, screams, and the unmistakable sound of handcuffs closing. I went out with Sophia in my arms. Trembling, and I saw several policemen pinning the man to the ground. A neighbor had seen the stranger force the door and called the authorities. It was an act of luck, a moment of providence that arrived just in time. Sophia's parents arrived shortly after, horrified to learn what happened. Although that night ended without anyone being hurt, the experience left a mark on me. To this day, I don't know what the man's intentions were. I only know that that night changed my perception of safety forever. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear the footsteps of that man walking around the house. But I also remember the courage of that neighbor who made the crucial call. Since then, I have always been more cautious, and although fear continues to haunt me, I learned to value every moment of knowing how fragile life can be. This summer, I spent a lot of time at my friend Jose's house. Jose lives with his father on a large property about 20 minutes drive from my house. Although I already live on the outskirts of the city, it seems that we are in the middle of nowhere. Jose's father is a veterinarian and has a small hospital for animals on the property. They also have several animals like chickens, pigs, and sheep at home. The entrance to your house is long and winding, with about 100 m from the gate to the front door, passing trees, barns, and fields where the animals are in the daylight. It seems commonplace, but it is usually dark when I get there, so I can only see with the lights of my car or the flashlight of my cell phone. If there is no light in the house or moonlight, it is difficult to see where I am going. However, the house is always fun. They have a swimming pool, a huge television, a large piano, giant speakers that connect by Bluetooth, many pets such as dogs and cats, and a lot of space to walk. Jose's father and his girlfriend are usually in their world at night, so Jose practically gets in place. Many times we have friends around there. Jose likes to have people around. One night we invited a new friend, David. We met in the city center. David was nice, but he seemed a little clumsy. When he arrived, we let the dogs loose at the entrance to greet him and relax a bit. As we looked towards the entrance, I noticed that there was no extra car there. I asked David where he had parked, and he told me that his mother had parked it. I had left and that I would take A and returned. Jose and I were surprised because usually everyone was driving. We felt a little sorry for not having told David, knowing that it might be difficult to get A and so late, but he didn't seem worried and said it would be okay. We told him he could sleep in the attic if he didn't get away to get home. The night was good, although I ended up drinking more than what I was planning. After swimming and playing, we were relaxing on the sofa inside the house. I felt dizzy but not nauseating, and I was trying to relax when David came in. He said that he had managed to book a yacht that was almost at the entrance and asked me if I could accompany him there because it was dark and I didn't know the way. Without thinking much, I said yes, and we left the house alone. Then I realized I wasn't prepared for even a short walk in the dark. No shirt, no flashlight, and no cell phone. I was just wearing my swim shorts and worn flip-flops on the way to the gate. David used the light of his cell phone to show us the way. I walked him to the last bend before the gate, and as soon as we arrived, we saw the lights of the and illuminating the way. I said goodbye to him. He passed through the gate and turned around to go back. I immediately realized that the darkness was engulfing everything around me. As I rounded the curve, I couldn't see anything. I reached into my pocket to grab the cell phone and realized I didn't have it with me. I thought about running back to David to ask for his light, but I didn't want to delay him, so I decided to keep walking. I thought I just needed to follow the I walked, and eventually I would see the lights of the house. At that time, I couldn't see anything. The trees and bushes made it impossible. If the light on the terrace was on, maybe it wouldn't be so bad, but only the internal lights were on, and it was the worst moment. It was a new moon night, and the moon had already set. The night was cloudy, and we were far from any city light. It was the darkest night I'd ever seen. A wave of panic began to surge inside me, but I suppressed it, and my slightly drunken state tripped me up in just 15 seconds. I swerved Gonzalez. The farm animals were silent, lost in my thoughts. I didn't realize I'd gone out of the way again until I felt my flip-flops sinking into the soft ground, paused, and I struggled to adjust in my eyes to catch any sign of light. I saw some lights, but I couldn't tell which one was from Joseph's house and which were from distant neighbors hidden by dense trees. I was attracted to one light in particular and began to head towards it. A few steps later, I ran into a tree. I stepped back and tried to see that it had hit me, but I could only make out a vague and pale shape. I knew I had to keeping my hands in front to avoid further collisions. I turned 90 degrees, hoping to find my way back to the driveway, and kept walking. Then I felt something terrible touch my hands. A gigantic spider web enveloped me. It wasn't just a few threads. It seemed like I was walking on a wall of sticky threads. In a panic, I struggled trying to free myself from the spider web and any spiders that might be lurking. After a minute of frantic movements, I felt free from the web. Now my heart is messing hard and panic had invaded me. I tried to calm myself down to breathe normally, but I was hopelessly lost. Part of me wanted to just sit and wait until I could see, either waiting for the sunrise or until someone came to get me. These thoughts were going through my head. Someone would come to looking for me for hours. The only person I knew was out was David, and he was already on his way home. I had no way to contact him or anyone else. Jose and the others might think I had gone to sleep in the attic and wouldn't bother looking for me for a while. If I tried to walk into a light, I could end up going in the wrong direction. Maybe even entering the property of someone else. They might think I was there to cause trouble and react badly in the woods. Since I was lost in the trees, I had accidentally run deeper in panic. I always thought I'd know what to do if I got lost. I assumed I'd have my cell phone, or at least a light. I never imagined I'd be in complete darkness here. It's so remote and wooded. I doubted anyone would hear me, even if I screamed for help. Standing still and waiting seemed sensible, but also ridiculous. My notion of reality told me that I wasn't helpless. But I couldn't just stay out all night, an easy target for mosquitoes, ants, spiders, or any predator that might be lurking around. Thinking I was easy prey. I knew the house couldn't be more than about 100 m away. I just needed to figure out the right direction. I had to think clearly about, despite the panic and the effects of the alcohol. I closed my eyes and concentrated on breathing for a few minutes to calm down. When I opened them, I noticed that the sky had a slight brightness enough to outline the clouds against the trees. I looked around and saw a solid shape that looked like the roof of a barn. This could take me back to the road or further. I decided to take a chance and walk towards it, walking slowly with arms outstretched forward. Then I saw a faint line on the ground. It was the entrance. Feeling a wave of relief, I stepped on it and followed the dim view of the lights. I kept tripping out of the way and even hit a branch, but eventually I saw the house come through the front door. It was never so comforting. I went straight to the terrace to share the terrifying experience I had just survived. It could have been only a few minutes, but it was genuinely scary. I learned not to venture around here unprepared. Never again. My name is Fabian, and I work as a caretaker in an old cemetery on the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez. I have been in this position for almost 10 years, and although it is not a job that many would choose, I find in the solitude of this place something that I find almost therapeutic: silence, peace. Everything seems to be frozen in time, except sure, on Halloween night. That night is different. It's the worst of the year for anyone in my position. The city's teenagers usually find it funny, infiltrate the cemetery, make jokes and record videos for their social media. I understand it. People have always had a morbid fascination with death, and this particular cemetery has a grim reputation. A figure known as the Lady of White is not a recent myth of some tourists come convinced that if they walk the dirt paths after dark, they will be able to see it. It has always been difficult for me to understand why anyone would want to believe in such things. After all, my only job is to make sure that the graves are not vandalized and that no one walks where they should not. That Halloween night was my second as a place manager. It was still a novice at this, but I was ready to face another long night. My goal was clear: not to let any group of guys ruin my shift. The weather that night was perfect to scare away anyone who didn't belong there. It was cold, it was dark, and a full moon lit up the cemetery in a way that made it barely depend on mill internal. The shift started quietly, too quiet. The hours passed in silence. Disturbing, which made me nervous. The other watchmen had warned me that a silence like that was not normal on Halloween. They told me that if everything was too calm, it was because something bad was happening. I expected to hear at some point the laughter and distant screams of the teenagers who used to get into trouble around here, but that night nothing happened. Everything seemed surprisingly normal until, as I walked among the graves, I heard a sound that stopped me in seco. Was a cry. The high-pitched and clear cry of a baby. I stood still for a moment, scanning the area around me, but there was no one in sight. The sound was coming from afar. At that moment I knew I had to make a joke. I didn't get scared. Not for a second. I wondered how they had done it. Maybe they had hidden a phone playing the sound to make me lose time. Guys nowadays are very resourceful when it comes to playing jokes. However, as the crying continued, something in me began to feel uncomfortable. It was too real. The crying didn't sound like it was coming from a speaker. It was a genuine, heartbreaking cry. I decided to follow the sound, walking faster and irritated by the thought that someone had left a device there as part of a joke. When approaching where the sound was coming from, I saw something that stopped my heart. On an old and worn grave, There was a small lump wrapped in blankets. It couldn't be real. I slowly approached, my eyes fixed on the lump. At first I thought it was a toy, but there was something about the way it moved that made me doubt if someone had left a baby there as part of a joke. It was very bad taste. I was about to bend down to get a better look when suddenly a woman dressed in white appeared. She emerged from the darkness without making a sound, and she took the baby in her arms. My first instinct was to scream. I was convinced it was a joke. I exclaimed, "This is not funny." But the woman didn't respond. She walked slowly, holding the baby, as if she hadn't heard my words. I could barely make out her face under the white veil that covered it. "I'm going to call the police. I warned better to already with this. They have had enough fun. I'm sure they will have a great video for their networks." But she didn't stop. She kept walking in the direction of a large and ancient mausoleum, one that I rarely visited during my rounds. I accelerated El Paso, convinced that I could reach her. But when I reached the corner of the mausoleum, she had disappeared as if I would never have been there. I froze, unable to process what had just happened. The baby's crying had stopped, and the environment around me began to feel dense, as if the air had become heavier, suffocating, as if I were in a boiler room. I ran around the mausoleum, checking every corner, but there was no sign of the woman or the baby. The most disturbing thing was that I no longer believed that it was the case. Whether it was a joke, what I had witnessed was too real to be a mere joke, and that frightened me more than anything else. I decided to go back to my post, but halfway through the baby's cry came back, the same high-pitched cry that had taken me to that grave. It resounded in the darkness, but this time I hesitated to follow it. All my instincts told me not to do it, however. The possibility of that a baby was really in danger spoke louder than my fears. With my heart beating in my ears, I walked, slowly following the sound that took me back to the mausoleum where I had seen the woman disappear. The place was darker than usual. My flashlight barely illuminated a few meters in front of me, and the moonlight could not penetrate the shadows that covered that part of the cemetery. The crying now, it came from inside the mausoleum. I approached the small broken window, hoping to find a logical explanation for all this. But what I saw, or rather what I felt, was pure terror. From the blackness of the mausoleum, a hand came out, a rotten hand with flesh hanging and long, torn nails. Before I could react, that hand grabbed my face with inhuman force and began to drag me inwards. The hole in the window was too small for me to enter, but the being holding me didn't seem to notice that or didn't care. He pushed me and pulled me with terrifying force, hitting my head against the metal structure of the mausoleum. The pain was unbearable. I tried to scream, but the hand covered my mouth, squeezing so tightly that it felt like the skin on my face. The metallic taste of my own blood began to tear. It filled my mouth, and I knew that I would not survive much longer if that continued. I knocked on the door of the mausoleum again and again, desperate to free myself, but my strength was fading quickly. My body could not take it anymore. Just when I thought I would faint, the being let go. I fell to the ground, unable to move anymore. I no longer felt pain, which was worse because after so many blows I must feel something. My body was on the verge of collapse. I could barely breathe, but I was still conscious from the ground. My blurred vision caught the door of the mausoleum slowly opening. I saw a figure in a white dress come out of the interior. Pale and barefoot legs were approaching me. My mind was confused. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if it was all real, and then everything became dark. I woke up startled, panting in my small workstation. At first I thought I was still in the mausoleum, but I soon realized that I was in my cabin, where I usually sit during my shift. Before I could react, I let out a panicked cry. In front of me there was a face watching me. I screamed so loud that the face also got scared and ran away. They were some teenagers who had been watching me while I was sleeping. They ran away. As soon as they saw me react, I got up with difficulty, still dazed by what I had just experienced. I touched my face with my hands, looking for wounds or traces of what had happened. But there was nothing or a single mark. Everything had been a damn dream, the scariest and most real dream I had ever had in my life. I shook my head, trying to clear myself of that feeling of horror, and left the cabin to make another round of the cemetery aimlessly, trying not to think about what had just happened. Eventually my steps took me back to the mausoleum, the same place where in my dream everything had happened. I approached at the door, and as if I came out of a trance, I saw the inscription on the tombstone. I recognized the name and the date. It was the mausoleum of the Lady in White. At that moment, I remembered that I had seen her image on the tombstone before, a woman with a white veil and a baby in her arms carved in the stone. Just then I heard the baby's cry again. It only lasted a second, but it was enough to freeze me. The blood. I couldn't help but turn around and quickly leave there. For the first time, I missed the teenagers with their jokes and their bustle. The solitude of the cemetery was no longer therapeutic or peaceful to me now. I felt that something was watching me, something much older and darker than any legend I had ever heard. I knew something was not right with it from the first moment it crossed the door for the interview. Introduced herself as Giselle, a young woman with a peculiar appearance. She wore old-fashioned Herman glasses and had a rigid expression despite her strange attitude. Her professional behavior impressed us, and we decided to hire her as a babysitter. The first day, I showed her the house, explaining where we kept the hygiene items and the place intended for the children. However, I noticed that Giselle did not pay too much attention, except when she was watching television in the living room. She seemed absorbed. "You heard me?" I asked, annoyed. "Excuse me, I was distracted," she replied with a forced smile. Despite her quirks, she seemed to do her job. My 5-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter were shy children, but Giselle, though distant, managed to keep them under control. Yet something in her presence always made me uneasy. One afternoon, while tidying up my son's room, I found him holding his breath while Giselle folded her clothes and muttered something in a low voice. I slammed open the door. "What's going on here?" I asked the army. My son, with a red face from the lack of air, exhaled suddenly. Giselle looked at me calmly, as if nothing was unusual. "Nothing, lady. We were just playing," she replied with falid. My husband intervened after hearing my screams. We both warned Giselle that she was not in her place, punished the children, but she couldn't get me out of her mind. I wanted to send her away, but my husband insisted on giving her one last chance. From that day on, I decided to keep my interactions with her to a minimum. One night, while I was reviewing some documents, Giselle asked permission to go home. I asked her to wait until the children fell asleep. She didn't answer. She just gave a disturbing smile and left the room. That image haunted me throughout the evening. Around 2 o'clock in the early morning, I woke up with a sudden thirst. I went down to the kitchen, and while I was filling a glass of water, I felt a breath behind me. I became terrified and found Giselle standing in the semi-darkness. "I can go now, ma'am?" she asked in a voice serena. Fear paralyzed me. I woke up my husband, who took her home. Since then, I couldn't help but watch her with more distrust. Another day, during a picnic in the park, I saw as Giselle interacted with a woman. Her usually unchanging face reflected nervousness. The woman approached and hugged her, saying something that I could not hear completely. When I asked Giselle about that, she mentioned that the woman had been her nurse after an accident. Something in her answer did not fit, but I did not insist. That same night, while we were having dinner outside, I called the hospital where she had supposedly been hospitalized. The answer I received left me cold. Giselle did not. I was a patient recovered from an accident, but an intern of the psychiatric section. I had escaped months ago. We returned home as quickly as possible. When we arrived, the house was plunged into darkness. I called the children and Giselle, but no one answered. We ran upstairs to my daughter's room. The bed was empty. A sound of knocking guided us to the bathroom with our hearts beating frantically. I opened the door. There was Giselle on her back, sitting on the floor. A low laugh echoed as she stabbed something repeatedly. Her clothes were soaked with blood. When she felt our presence, she slowly turned around. Her face showed a macabre and wide smile. "What I have found," she said in a trembling voice as she showed us what was left of a doll that my daughter adored. But the blood on her clothes was not from the doll. Almost a decade ago, when she was studying dentistry in a renowned public university in Mexico City, my life seemed destined for something promising. I had landed a place in one of the most competitive institutions in the country, an achievement that filled me with pride and satisfaction. Although tuition was incredibly accessible, there was a hidden price that I did not expect: the emotional and ethical cost of my education. Every day I faced an exhausting journey, more than 2 hours by public transport between to and from the university. This sacrifice was a small part of the effort I had to make to keep up with the demands of a field as competitive as dentistry. Practice was essential, and to be truly competent we needed something that was not within the reach of everyone: real human teeth. There began the real challenge. In a public university, resources were limited. While in private institutions you could count on high-quality artificial teeth, in our school, that was practically an unattainable luxury. Here learning required ingenuity and sometimes questionable methods among students. It was rumored that teachers rarely offered guidance on how to get these materials, instead leaving it up to us to figure it out. It was then that I began to hear about less orthodox methods of getting what we needed. Cemeteries, morgues, and even sale clandestine through the internet were mentioned as solutions. But at first I did not imagine that these stories could be real. Not until a friend suggested that I contact someone who, according to him, had the ability to achieve anything. My curiosity, mixed with the pressure to excel in my studies, led me to make a decision that would change my life. I still remember the first time we spoke. It was not a common exchange. The person operated in the shadows of the so-called deep web, a place where the rules of the outside world did not exist. He explained that he could get me whatever I asked for. Teeth, bones, and even entire skulls. The price, of course, depended on the specificity of my order. Although his words were direct, there was a somber tone that made me feel chills. What disturbed me the most was the ease with which he offered me fresher alternatives, suggesting I could get materials directly from hospitals or morgues. Despite my growing discomfort, I placed my order. 34 pieces of teeth with a mixture of healthy decayed teeth and molars. Desk. The final price was not cheap, but not unattainable either. A part of me already wanted to go back, but the pressure to comply with my practices forced me to go ahead. The exchange took place in a public place, but the tension in the atmosphere was undeniable. The person I met didn't stand out at all. He dressed simply, like someone who would simply go unnoticed in any crowd. When I returned home with my groceries, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. I had gotten what I needed, but the moral price I would pay I still didn't understand. In a jar in my kitchen, I kept my teeth and hid them in the most hidden corner of my closet. At that moment, it all seemed like a practical decision, but a sense of unease began to settle in my mind that night while I was trying to sleep. A series of dark thoughts began to torment me. Where those teeth really came from, who they had belonged to, and the most disturbing thing that person would have done to get them. Remorse began to invade me from the first moment I closed the closet with my teeth hidden inside. I tried to convince myself that I had done it for a good cause, that it was an academic and professional necessity, but the images of looted cemetery and desecrated bodies did not cease to torment me for days. I felt observed, as if carrying those teeth made me guilty of something bigger than my perceptive mother as always noticed that something was wrong with me. My answers were short and evasive, and she began to insist on I knew that I couldn't tell him no. I still didn't know how to explain to him that I had participated in something so dark. The teeth became a tangible weight on my conscience. I knew I couldn't use it without my mind being filled with doubts and blame. In one of the few honest conversations I had with my peers on the subject, some encouraged me to move on, to ignore the details and simply use it to practice others. More critics warned me that getting involved in this type of transaction was not only dangerous, but it perpetuates a sinister cycle from which it was better to stay away. One night, unable to bear that feeling of guilt anymore, I made a decision. If I couldn't return those teeth to those who belonged, at least I could return them to Earth. That same morning, when the sky was darker and the streets deserted, I left with the jar in a backpack. I walked to a park not far from my house. It was a quiet place during the day, but in the gloom of the night every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was amplified with hands. I began to finish a small hole in a hidden area under some bushes. My movements were rapid, but each rustling of the dry leaves around me made me stop. I felt as if someone or something was watching me. Once the hole was deep enough, I poured in. I stood there for a few minutes looking at the newly disturbed surface of the ground. With a mixture of relief and terror, I returned home feeling slightly lighter, but it didn't take long for me to realize that something had changed. That very night the dreams began. They were blurry at first, images of cemeteries, loose teeth rolling on the floor, faces I didn't recognize but staring at me, a feeling of weight in my chest. I woke up startled. During the day the common noises in my home seemed more intense. I heard knocks in the closet where the teeth had been. Even though I knew that I didn't anymore, there was nothing there. One afternoon, while I was trying to concentrate on my studies, my mother came into my room with a serious look. She told me that she knew something was disturbing me and that she couldn't help me if I didn't tell her the truth. I had no more strength to hide it. I confessed everything to her. At first she didn't say anything. She just looked at me, evaluating my words, my tone, and perhaps trying to understand what had led her son to be something so strange. He finally sighed deeply and told me that he had done the right thing by bringing his teeth back to Earth. but that he needed to find a way to make things right in the future that night. As he tried to rest after our conversation, dreams changed. They were no longer vague images, they were clear visions. He was standing in the park right where he had buried his teeth in front of me. An indistinct figure wrapped in shadows pointed at me with a long finger, and Delgado didn't speak, but I felt his reproach. His presence was so intense that I woke up in a cold sweat. I began to doubt if I had really buried my teeth deep enough, and if anyone found them, and if that figure in my dreams was a warning. I spent days debating between I went back to the park to check it out or try to leave everything in the past. But something, a force I couldn't explain, it seemed to push me to face what had begun. The pressure of dreams became unbearable every night. The shadowy figure became clearer, more tangible. His eyes, or what seemed to be his eyes, shone with a dull glow, as if his gaze went directly through my soul. Every time I woke up I had the same feeling of emptiness in my chest, as if something was tearing me from within. I decided that I couldn't go on living with that weight one night long. After the rest of my family had gone to sleep, I grabbed a flashlight and a small shovel ready to head back to the park. The road was slow. Each step felt like a sentence. As I approached the place where I had buried my teeth, the air seemed to get heavier, as if the world itself wanted to stop me. I arrived at the exact place where I had left them. The marks of the ground were still visible despite the days that had passed. I turned on the flashlight and knelt down to start finishing. While the shovel stirred the earth, I felt a chill run down my spine. But it wasn't just the cold of the night, it was something else, something that seemed to be watching me from the shadows. When I finally reached the jar, I lifted it with trembling hands. At first glance it seemed intact, but something about it felt different. The lid was covered in a light layer of moisture, although the jar had been well sealed. A feeling of vertigo invaded me, but I forced myself to stand firm. My intention was to take the teeth to a more suitable place, perhaps a cemetery, so that at least they could rest in peace on the way home. The silence was deafening. There was no wind or the usual sound of Los Grillos. It was as if the whole world had stopped. I felt a weight in the air, a presence that seemed to follow me closely. Every time I turned around, I didn't see anything, but my instinct told me that I wasn't alone. I got to my room and put the scratch in a bag to hide it temporarily that night. However, I couldn't sleep at dawn. While I tried to keep my eyes closed, I heard a sound. It was a whisper, low, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to freeze me in my bed. They were not words, but a constant murmur, as if someone were trying to communicate from far away. The dawnware, where I had kept the jar, was on my desk, motionless, but the whispers seemed to emanate directly from there. I mustered up enough courage to get up, turned on the light in my room, and slowly approached the desk. The room was completely silent now, but the air was still heavy from that strange energy. When I finally opened the bag and took the jar, something made me drop it suddenly. Inside, the teeth seemed to move, not physically, but as if something in them vibrated or pulsated with an energy of its own. The jar rolled on the floor but did not break, however. Something fell from the inside, a small fragment of paper that I had not seen before. With trembling fingers I picked it up. It was dirty, with brown stains that I didn't want to analyze too much. The written letters were beery, as if someone had traced them in a desperate hurry. I said, "You shouldn't have touched what doesn't belong to you." The message paralyzed me. It was impossible that the paper had been there before. I had washed the jar myself before using it. My mind was trying to find logical explanations, but panic didn't let me think clearly. I felt that I was playing with something much bigger than of what I could understand. That same morning I decided to seek help. I remembered that one of my university classmates, Mariana, always spoke of her grandmother, a woman who, according to her, had a deep knowledge of rituals and energies. Without knowing who else to turn to, I asked her to take me with her. Mariana, noticing my state of desperation, accepted immediately. The grandmother received us with a calmness that contrasted with my anxiety. She looked at the jar with an intense look, but she didn't touch it. She asked me to tell her everything, from the moment I had placed the order to my dreams and what happened the night before. When I finished, she simply nodded as if she already knew the end of the story. "What you have done cannot be easily undone," she said in a deep voice. "These feelings are not just physical remains. They are charged with the energy of those who have done them. Possessed, and some of them have not found rest." He explained to me that I would need to perform a ritual to appease what had disturbed, but he also warned me that once something like this is unleashed, you can never be completely sure that it is over. The ritual was prepared at dusk. Following the directions of Mariana's grandmother, he asked me to take the jar with the scents and something that would connect me with them. An object that represented my regret and my intention to make amends for what I had done. After thinking about it a bit, I chose a small necklace that I had worn since childhood, a gift from my mother that I always considered a symbol of protection. The grandmother began the ritual on a small improvised altar in the backyard of her house, lit black and white candles, placed dried herbs around the jar, and poured and soil into a circle that enclosed all while I muttered words in a language I didn't understand. I felt the atmosphere around me grow thicker and denser. The air seemed to vibrate and my skin stood on end as if something invisible was watching us. "This is not a punishment, son," he told me in a calm but firm tone. "It is a teaching. What you took belongs to the earth, and the earth always claims what is theirs." He asked me to hold thee as she continued the ritual. As soon as I touched the glass, a wave of emotions hit me hard. Sadness, anger, despair. It was as if each tooth carried with it a fragment of the life of the person to whom it had belonged. Tears began to run down my cheeks without me being able to stop them. The grandmother finally took the jar from my hands and placed it in the center of the altar with slow movements, and ceremonial covered it with a white cloth while dropping drops of a liquid that smelled of herbs and spices. The flames of the candles flickering violently, and for a moment I thought I heard a whisper similar to the one I had heard in my room, but more distant, as if she were walking away when she finished. The grandmother motioned for me to take the jar to a specific place, a small forgotten cemetery on the outskirts of the city. According to her, that place was known for being a resting point for wandering souls. There I had to bury the jar and leave the necklace next to it as a symbol of my repentance. That same night, accompanied by Mariana, I went to the cemetery. The place was deserted, covered with weeds and tombstones worn by time. The moon barely illuminated the way as we advanced towards the indicated place. Every step I took felt like if an invisible burden became lighter, but the fear persisted. We found a quiet corner under an old tree that seemed to have been there for centuries. With a small shovel, a hole deep enough fits, and I placed the jar inside before covering it with dirt. I left the necklace on the lid, murmur. The next nights were quiet, without dreams or whispers, though I could not say that I felt completely at peace. If I noticed that the in my chest had diminished, the experience left me with a lesson that I would never forget. Some lines are not made to be crossed, and the consequences of doing so can haunt you in ways you would never imagine. Since then I have stayed away from any path that leads me into the shadows. I finished my studies and found ethical ways to learn and practice, although I never stopped thinking about the teeth buried in that cemetery. I sometimes wonder if they really rested or if they were just waiting for their turn to return. As a child in a small town in Mexico, I experienced something that marked me forever. It all happened when I was about 11 years old. It was a Saturday night and my mothers were due to attend an important work event. I was excited. I was starting to feel older. I needed someone to take care of me. However, my enthusiasm crumbled when I was informed that they had hired a nanny. A university student named Mariana. Mariana arrived on time, and at first I thought she was friendly. She was young, pretty, and even proposed that we have a sleepover, watching my favorite movie. Even my parents left money to order a pizza, which encouraged me a little. When Mariana picked up the phone and ordered a pizza, that's when everything started to get weird. She asked me what my favorite ingredient was, and when I mentioned the pepperoni, she let out a mocking laugh and told me that she was a vegetarian. She ordered a large pizza with spicy vegetables without taking into account my opinion. I didn't care much at first, but soon I felt excluded from something that was supposed to be fun. A while later I heard a series of knocks on the door. I thought it was the delivery man, but when I looked out from the stairs, I saw a man entering the house. Mariana received him with a smile, and they immediately hugged and kissed. It was evident that he was her boyfriend, despite the fact that my parents had made it clear that I should not receive visitors. At that moment I was filled with anger. I went downstairs determined to look for the phone to call my parents, but I didn't find it. They had disconnected it surely so that I couldn't use it. I returned to the living room where they were, but when I opened the door I was scared. Mariana screamed, and without even hearing me, she closed the door with a desperate blow. I tried to explain to her that I was hungry and wanted to talk to my parents, but she ignored me completely and ordered me to go up to my room. Despite my fear, I refused to leave, and then it happened, something that made the atmosphere go from uncomfortable, scary. From the living room I heard a slight moan. Laffy, our Australian shepherd dog, was locked up with them. She was my best friend, and I didn't understand why they had her there. When I asked to be let out, Mariana and her boyfriend made fun of me. I went up to my room for a moment, but the restlessness overcame me. I decided to go back and face Mariana. I opened the door forcefully, and what I saw, she left me paralyzed. Her boyfriend was throwing a heavy ball similar to a cricket directly at Laffy. She let out a heartbreaking howl when she received the blow to her hind leg. I ran to try to help her, but Mariana's boyfriend pushed me violently into the hallway, closed the door forcefully, and placed something against her, preventing me from going back in. I went up crying to my room, hugging a pillow while listening to the moans. I had never felt so afraid and helpless. When my parents arrived that night, I did not leave my room. I heard Mariana invent an absurd story saying that I had behaved terribly badly, that I had not let her do her job for a moment. It seemed that my parents believed her until my dad noticed that he limped and had a big mark on his paw. When he saw her, he knew that something was wrong, and he asked me for explanations in tears. I told them what had happened. The police were called immediately. Mariana and her boyfriend tried to deny everything, but my dad was furious and did not let them escape the consequences. Days later, they were both arrested for animal cruelty, and her boyfriend received a severe sentence despite the fact that justice was done. I never forgot that night. Since then, I deeply distrust people. I don't know if I learned something is that we must not let our guard down with those we let into our life, and much less into our home. When I was about 3 years old, my parents, who are now divorced, were friends with a couple who worked with my dad in the office. They always offered to take care of me and loved spending time with me. My parents never suspected anything strange. They saw them as reliable and kind people. One day, this couple gave them a lot of fun. He asked my mom for permission to take me with them to a theme park along with his niece. My mom without hesitation accepted. However, my dad had a different reaction. It seemed strange to him that they insisted so much on taking me, and above all that they offered to cover everything, all the expenses. Something in that offer did not fit with a feeling that he could not ignore. My dad invented an excuse for me not to go. Later from that conversation, the couple disappeared completely. They stopped visiting our house, they did not answer calls, and they were not seen at work. Weeks later, the office where my dad worked began an investigation. Apparently, this couple had committed a massive fraud, stealing an exorbitant amount of money. They had vanished without a trace. The news left everyone shocked. My dad found it difficult to assimilate that people so close to our family, those we had trusted, were capable of something like that. But what disturbed him the most was the possibility that their intentions with me were not as innocent as they seemed. My dad was convinced that they wanted to take me away and disappear with me. He believed that maybe they could not have children, and they had planned to take me as their own. This idea terrified him, even though it was never known that it became of them. My dad was always grateful to have I was home that day. My mom, confident as she was willing to let me go. I can't help but think about what might have happened if my dad hadn't intervened. I could have grown up with a completely different family in a faraway place, not knowing anything of my true identity. Sometimes in the evenings, I still think about what could have become of me and what kind of life I would have led if I had gone up to that car with them. But above all, I think of the darkness that can be hidden behind a friendly smile and an overly generous offer. Thank you for joining me on this tour full of stories. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to not miss more horror stories. And remember, in the description you will find links to everything you need, our official store, the Members Club for access and exclusive content, and much more. I'm the narrator, and we'll see each other in the shadows very soon.